Picture this. October 2005. The sun is barely up over Atlanta, the city that had become their kingdom. Their playground, their stage, their fortress is still asleep. The strip clubs are dark. The Maybachs are parked. And then the radios crackle. Federal agents in unmarked vehicles fan out across multiple states simultaneously. Detroit, Atlanta, Los Angeles, St. Louis, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Louisville, Greenville, South Carolina, Columbus, Georgia. It is not a local operation. This is a culmination of a 2-year coordinated federal offensive involving the Drug Enforcement Administration, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, and the DEA Special Operations Division, the same people who go after cartels. They are coming for the Black Mafia family. They are coming for 2 brothers from the southwest side of Detroit who started with nothing but $50 bags of cocaine and a hunger of men who have been told their entire lives that they didn't belong anywhere near wealth. Men who had watched their parents work themselves to bone dust and still couldn't afford new shoes for their kids. Men who had decided, somewhere in the late 1980s, that the rules of the game were rigged against people like them, and that the only way to win was to play a different game entirely. In Frisco, Texas, federal agents converge on a large home in the suburbs. Inside is Demetrius Edward Flannery, known to every hustler, rapper, celebrity, and drug dealer from Detroit to Miami as Big Meech, the man who once threw parties where he dropped millions of dollars in a single night, the man who wore fur coats and diamonds the size of thumbnails, the man who had his name tattooed on strangers' skin as a badge of honor, the man who had moved so much cocaine to the United States that the DEA would later allege his organization was responsible for trafficking approximately 2,500 kilograms of cocaine every single month. Simultaneously, in St. Louis, Missouri, federal agents stopped another vehicle. Inside is Terry Lee Flannery, the quieter one, the one who never wanted the spotlight, known to the streets as Southwest T, the operational brain behind the Los Angeles hub that had transformed Mexican cartel cocaine into American street cash on an industrial scale. The DEA would later announce that Operation Motor City Mafia, a 2-year investigation that generated over 900 pages of wiretap transcripts, informant testimonies, seized financial records, and surveillance documentation, had dealt what they called a knockout blow to the self-named Black Mafia family. 30 members arrested in the first wave alone. More to follow. Over $3 million in cash and assets seized immediately. Over 630 kilograms of cocaine, already in evidence lockers from prior raids. 13 multi-million-dollar mansions. 36 vehicles. Jewelry from Jacob the Jeweler in New York City. A rap label. A promise of the American dream built entirely on cocaine, blood, and the most dangerous kind of ambition. Prosecutors would later allege that Big Meech and Southwest T had generated an estimated $270 million through the course of their operations. This is that story. This is a complete, factual, documented story of the Black Mafia family. From the first $50 bag of cocaine sold on a Detroit street corner, to the raids that shook the nation, to the prison cells, to the pop culture immortality that came after, the rise, the reign, the war between 2 brothers, the government that hunted them for 15 years, and the legacy that refused to die even after the empire fell. Before we get into this, where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop your city and time in the comments right now. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because we tell stories like this every single week. Drop a like if you love true crime and gangster stories. Let's go. To understand what the Black Mafia family became, you have to first understand what Detroit was in the 1980s. Not the Detroit of today, with its Midtown revival and its craft breweries and its art installations rising from the rubble. We are talking about Reagan-era Detroit, the Detroit of the crack epidemic, the Detroit of deindustrialization, where the big 3 automakers, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, had begun the quiet devastation of an entire workforce, shipping jobs overseas and to non-union plants in the South, leaving hundreds of thousands of working-class families in a city that had been built on one thing and was suddenly losing that one thing. Detroit in the 1980s was a city in free fall. The unemployment rate among black Detroiters in certain neighborhoods during this era was catastrophic. The crack cocaine epidemic, which was sweeping the nation's inner cities with terrifying speed, hit Detroit particularly hard. Into this environment, two phenomena emerged simultaneously. The first was the rise of enormously powerful street organizations dealing drugs on a level that previous generations of hustlers could not have imagined. The second was the story of two brothers named Flannery. Demetrius Edward Flannery was born on June 21st, 1968, in Detroit, Michigan. His brother Terry Lee Flannery would come after him. They grew up in the southwest side of Detroit, a working-class neighborhood that had not yet been entirely swallowed by the devastation hitting other parts of the city, but was close enough to feel the pressure. Their parents, Charles and Lucille Flannery, were described by people who knew the family as hard-working and deeply religious. The Bible was open in their house. Charles worked. Lucille worked. They were not absent. They were not indifferent. They were, by every account, a loving family trying to survive in a system that seemed designed to exhaust them without ever letting them get ahead. This detail matters enormously, because so much of mythology around men like Big Meech centers on the absent father, the broken home, the chaos that supposedly makes crime inevitable. The Flannery brothers did not come from chaos. They came from love and from faith, and from a household where their parents genuinely tried, and they still turned to the street. That truth is more complicated and more uncomfortable than any simple narrative, and it is the truth nonetheless. What Demetrius and Terry saw on the streets of Detroit as teenagers in the mid-1980s was a city within a city, a parallel economy operating in plain sight. The crack cocaine trade was not subtle. It was not hidden. It was out in the open, visible on every corner of certain neighborhoods, and it came with visible rewards that no legitimate job available to young black men in Detroit could match. New cars, gold chains, respect, power, an escape from the grinding poverty that was slowly suffocating everyone they knew who played by the rules. Detroit in the 1980s had two particularly legendary criminal organizations that shaped the imagination of every young person watching from the sidewalks. The first was Young Boys Incorporated, known as YBI, an organization so sophisticated in its approach to street-level drug dealing that it was essentially a corporation with structured hierarchies, territories, employee rules, and profit distribution. YBI, at its peak in the early 1980s, was generating millions of dollars annually and had turned crack cocaine distribution into something approaching an industrial operation. Their influence on the hustlers who came after them cannot be overstated. The second was the Chambers brothers, BJ, Larry, Willie, and Otis, who operated one of the most extensive crack cocaine enterprises in Detroit's history during the 1980s. The Chambers brothers are said to have been the real-world inspiration for the film New Jack City. Their operation was so enormous that they controlled an entire apartment complex, the Broadmoor on East Grand Boulevard, which they essentially turned into a 24-hour crack distribution warehouse. Federal videotapes of the Chambers brothers counting money and displaying their wealth were shown on national television. The impact on every ambitious street hustler watching was seismic. According to Big Meech himself, speaking in a recorded federal prison phone interview that would later become widely cited, the Chambers brothers and Young Boys Incorporated were the templates. They showed young men like Demetrius and Terry Flannery what was possible. They showed that a black man from Detroit with nothing but intelligence and hunger could build something that the legitimate world would never offer him. Whether that lesson was wise or catastrophic would only become clear decades later. If you want to know the reason for us first getting the game, Big Meech said, it was just about being poor, man. We on welfare, at the gas station with food stamps. We keep catching the bus with holes in the bottom of your shoes. That was the motivation. We got to do something. Fast. Once me and my brother got a real taste of money. It's like you don't never want that feeling to go away. That statement is perhaps the most honest and devastating articulation of why the drug trade captures so many young men who might, in a different world, have channeled their intelligence and ambition into something different. Big Meech was not stupid. By any measure, the qualities of the business world calls entrepreneurial instinct. Vision, leadership, risk tolerance, the ability to read people and build loyalty, Demetrius Flannery had in abundance. In a different world, with different circumstances and different options, the man who would build the Black Mafia family might have built a Fortune 500 company. But this was not a different world. This was Southwest Detroit in 1985, and the options on the table looked nothing like a Fortune 500 company. Demetrius was approximately 17 years old when he and his brother began selling cocaine on the streets of their neighborhood. Initially, they were moving what the streets called dime bags, small quantities, $50 worth of crack cocaine at a time. This was the very bottom of the operation, street-level retail, the riskiest point in the entire drug trade, where the money is smallest and the exposure to violence and arrest is greatest. But it was also where they started. And in the story of the Black Mafia Family, where they started is almost incomprehensibly far from where they ended up. Their first organizational affiliation was with a crew known as the 50 Boys, a name derived from the $50 packages they sold. They operated under the guidance of a man named Edric E.D. Boyd, who was himself mentored by a former Young Boys Incorporated lieutenant named Norman Sneed Johnson. The lineage was direct. YBI had shaped the template. E.D. Boyd had absorbed it. And now E.D. Boyd was passing it down to two hungry teenagers named Demetrius and Terry. E.D. Boyd would later tell Vlad TV that he knew from early on that these brothers were different. He said he had groomed them from day one to be bosses. That the day they eventually grew beyond him was something he had intended all along. Whether that account contains the usual embellishment of hindsight or not, what is undeniable is that under E.D. Boyd's early mentorship, Demetrius and Terry Flannery learned the foundations of organized drug distribution, how to manage a crew, how to handle money, how to think about scale, how to protect territory. They also learned that the street demanded something beyond business. It demanded proof. And in the late 1980s, that proof came in blood. During the early years of their operation, both brothers were shot. The street was not a classroom. It was a battlefield, and the curriculum was written in consequence. Terry Flannery was shot in the right eye during a street conflict. The damage was permanent. He would spend the rest of his life with partial sight in that eye. Demetrius was shot in the neck outside a Chinese restaurant in the late 1980s. He survived. He did not leave the game. He went deeper. For two young men who had already decided that the legitimate world offered them nothing worth having, violence was not a deterrent. It was proof of their commitment. And in the brutal arithmetic of the street, surviving violence earned a currency that no amount of money could buy on its own. It earned respect. By the late 1980s, Demetrius and Terry Flannery were no longer just two kids selling bags of cocaine on a corner. They were building something. Recruiting from trusted associates, childhood friends, and neighborhood contacts who had proven their reliability. They were thinking about structure, about hierarchy, about how to grow something that was more than just a crew. They were, in a language that would not be applied to them for years yet, thinking about an organization. And in 1989, according to the historical record, the Black Mafia Family was formally established. The name itself came later. The BMF acronym, according to most accounts, wasn't formally adopted and used until around the year 2000. But the organization, the bones of it, the crew structure, the ambition, the brotherhood, that was 1989. That was Demetrius and Terry Flannery looking at the city around them, looking at the organization they had built, and deciding that the rules of the game they were playing were about to change. The late 1980s and early 1990s were years of growth and violence for the organization that would become BMF. Growth, because Demetrius and Terry were rapidly moving beyond street-level retail into something more resembling wholesale distribution. Violence, because the street never allows expansion without contestation. By this point, the brothers were operating on Detroit's southwest side with a level of sophistication that set them apart from the average corner crew. They were thinking in terms of supply chains, distribution networks, and territory, not just individual transactions. And they were beginning to understand one of the most fundamental principles of drug trafficking at scale. The real money is not in retail. The real money is in wholesale. The real money is not in selling to users. The real money is in supplying the people who sell to users. This insight, obvious in retrospect, but genuinely sophisticated for teenage street hustlers, will become the cornerstone of the BMF business model. They were not trying to control every corner. They were trying to control the supply to the corners. They were not trying to be the biggest dealers in Detroit. They were trying to be the source that the biggest dealers in Detroit came to. During this period, the brothers also encountered a business opportunity that would prove defining: connections to Mexican cartel cocaine sources. This introduction came through a California drug trafficker named Wayniak Joyner. The details of how this connection was established involved the kind of introductions that happen in the shadow world of drug trafficking: mutual associations, trusted vouchers, and the credibility that comes from having moved enough product to be taken seriously by people operating at a higher level. What the Mexican cartel connection meant in practical terms was transformative. Instead of buying cocaine from other American distributors, which meant paying markup on markup, price point stacked on price point, the Flannery brothers were now able to obtain their product closer to the source. According to later court documents and investigative reports, BMF was eventually purchasing cocaine wholesale directly from a Mexican cartel at approximately $9,000 per kilogram. They were then selling it to street-level dealers at approximately $17,000 per kilogram. The margin was enormous. The competitive advantage was devastating. When you are buying at $9,000 per kilo and selling at $17,000 per kilo, you can offer your customers, the street distributors buying from you, a better price than anyone else in the market while still generating massive profit. BMF could undercut every competitor not because they were more ruthless or more violent than other organizations, but because their supply chain was more efficient. They had eliminated the middlemen. They had gone to the source. And they passed a portion of those savings downstream to create loyalty and demand that no competitor could match. This was not street corner logic. This was business strategy. And it worked with terrifying effectiveness. By the early 1990s, the brothers were also beginning to encounter the first sustained interest from law enforcement. Police investigations into their activities had begun before the organization even had a name, before anyone outside of Detroit's Southwest Side knew what the words Black Mafia Family meant. Local narcotics units were watching the Flannery brothers. The money was too visible. The operation was growing too fast. The streets were talking. In 1994, Demetrius Flannery and a Colombian associate were arrested on drug charges. This was a serious moment, the kind of moment that ends careers and redirects lives. But the case fell apart. It was eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence. Demetrius walked, and if the experience was meant to teach him caution, it taught him something else instead: that the game could be survived, that evidence was hard to gather, that with the right lawyers and the right discretion, the walls could be held. Terry, meanwhile, had been shot in his right eye. The eye surgery that followed resulted in a medical malpractice suit, and Terry ultimately received a settlement from that lawsuit. The amount was not publicly disclosed, but what Terry Flannery did with that settlement money would become a footnote of dark irony in the BMF story. He used it to found a taxi service, one of the first legitimate business fronts the brothers would use to launder their drug proceeds. A legitimate taxi service, funded by medical malpractice compensation, used to wash millions of dollars in cocaine money. The BMF story is full of moments like this, where the mundane and the extraordinary intertwine in ways that make the entire thing feel less like crime history and more like mythology. By the mid-1990s, Demetrius and Terry Flannery had expanded their operation well beyond Detroit and beyond Michigan. They were making inroads into Kentucky, Georgia, Missouri, Texas, and California. They were moving cocaine not in grams or even single kilograms, but in quantities that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. And they were beginning to do something that would define the organization in its mature phase. They were beginning to think about structure, about division of labor, about how to run an empire that spanned multiple states without losing control of any of it. The answer, as it always is in organizations of this scale, was hierarchy. BMF developed a structure that law enforcement officials and later journalists would compare to a corporation. At the top were Demetrius and Terry. Below them were regional lieutenants, trusted associates who managed specific geographic territories. Below the lieutenants were workers who handled packaging, transportation, distribution, and collections. The communication protocols were designed to create insulation. If a lower-level member was arrested and talked, they would ideally only have information about the people immediately above them, not about the leadership of the organization. This structure was never perfect. No criminal organization structure ever is. but it was more sophisticated than most, and it reflected a genuinely strategic mind at work. The man who would later be described as charismatic and flamboyant, who would throw million-dollar parties and put his name on billboards across Atlanta, was, in the operations of this period, a careful and strategic thinker who understood that an organization that grew too fast, too visibly, and without discipline would not survive. The contradiction between the careful strategist and the spectacular showman would define Big Meech for his entire career, and it would ultimately be part of his undoing. In the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, Atlanta, Georgia was undergoing a transformation. The city that would eventually become one of the most significant cultural and economic capitals of Black America was still in the early stages of that emergence. Hip-hop was beginning to find its southern voice. The city's entertainment industry was growing, and the drug trade in Atlanta was in a state of upheaval. For decades, the cocaine market in Atlanta had been dominated by a crew known as the Miami Boys, a Florida-based network that had established deep roots in Atlanta's street economy. The Miami Boys were not amateurs. They were a sophisticated, well-connected organization that had controlled significant portions of Atlanta's cocaine distribution for years. But in the early 1990s, federal investigators dismantled the Miami Boys through a series of prosecutions and convictions. The organization collapsed. And where a powerful criminal organization collapses, it leaves a vacuum. Markets don't cease to function because their suppliers go to prison. They find new suppliers. The customers, the distributors, the street networks that have been built over years. They were still there. They just needed a new source. Demetrius and Terry Flannery were paying attention. The move to Atlanta was not impulsive or accidental. It was calculated. Atlanta represented, for the BMF, exactly what every market expansion represents in any business context: an opportunity to enter a disrupted market with a superior product at a competitive price, and to establish dominance before anyone else fills the vacuum. The brothers moved aggressively. They brought their connections, their supply chain, their organizational structure, and their competitive pricing to a city that was ready for exactly what they were offering. Atlanta was also, critically, a transportation hub. The city sits at the intersection of major interstate highway arteries: I-75, I-85, I-20, I-285, that stretch in every direction across the southeastern and midwestern United States. If you wanted to move product from a hub city to distribution points across the South, the Midwest, and up the eastern seaboard, Atlanta was a near-perfect location. The Flannery brothers understood this with the clarity of people who had been thinking about supply chains for years. They also understood something else about Atlanta that was perhaps less obvious. The city's relationship with its black community was different from Detroit's. Atlanta had a substantial and economically powerful black middle class and professional class, a legacy of historically black colleges and universities, and the civil rights movement that had made the city one of its headquarters. Atlanta's culture was self-confident and outward-facing in ways that Detroit's was not. And Atlanta, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, was becoming the center of gravity for Southern hip-hop, a cultural movement that was about to become the most commercially dominant force in American music. Big Meech had always had a certain cultural antenna. He was not just a businessman. He was a showman, a presence, someone who understood that in the world he was operating in, image was not decoration. It was infrastructure, the way you carried yourself, the clothes you wore, the cars you drove, the people you were seen with. These were not luxuries. They were advertisements. They were signals of power and stability that attracted the kind of people you needed to do business with. They were the brand. And Atlanta was the perfect city in which to build a brand. The BMF's Atlanta operation initially centered on distribution, moving the cocaine that was coming through from Mexican cartel sources via the Los Angeles hub that Southwest T was establishing simultaneously. The brothers had divided the empire geographically in a way that played to each of their strengths. Big Meech was the face, the network builder, the person whose personality could walk into a room full of strangers and walk out with 10 new allies. He ran Atlanta. Southwest T was the operational mind. Quieter, more conservative, less interested in spectacle, more focused on systems and logistics. He ran Los Angeles. Atlanta served as the primary distribution hub. the place where the cocaine arrived, was divided and went out to a network of street-level distributors across the southeastern United States and beyond. Los Angeles served as the entry point, the hub closest to the Mexican cartel sources, where large shipments came in and were then transported east and distributed nationally. Between these two hubs, BMF established additional distribution points in Detroit, St. Louis, and multiple other cities. The network was growing into exactly what the brothers had always envisioned, a multi-state, vertically integrated cocaine distribution enterprise with direct supply from the source and distribution tentacles reaching across the country. The scale of what they built is worth pausing on, because the numbers strain credibility even when you know they are documented in federal court records. At its peak, BMF's Atlanta hub alone was responsible for distributing approximately 2,500 kilograms of cocaine per month. That is 2.5 metric tons of cocaine every month, coming through a single distribution hub in Atlanta. The total operation, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Detroit, St. Louis, and the distribution points in states including Georgia, Alabama, Illinois, Louisiana, Michigan, Mississippi, Texas, Ohio, Florida, South Carolina, Kentucky, and beyond, was moving quantities of cocaine that placed BMF in a category that the DEA's Special Operations Division, which typically targets international drug cartels, took seriously. The 500-person workforce is another number that staggers imagination. Over 500 people at BMF's organizational peak were employed in various capacities by the Black Mafia family. As lieutenants, as couriers, as street distributors, as money counters, as legitimate business fronts, as security. 500 people whose economic survival was tied to the continued operation of an enterprise built on two boys from Detroit with holes in their shoes. The cocaine itself was transported through the BMF supply chain by methods that combine creativity with scale. Couriers moved product in luxury vehicles, in motorhomes, in tractor-trailers, in limos. On April 11th, 2004, a date that would later become significant in the federal case, a BMF courier named Jabari Hayes was pulled over on Interstate 44 in Phelps County, Missouri, driving a 40-foot motorhome. He was stopped for swerving over the fog line when an AK-9 unit was brought to the scene. 2 suitcases in the back of a Range Rover being towed by the motorhome were found to contain approximately 95 kilograms of cocaine and 572 grams of marijuana. This single stop gave federal investigators an enormous intelligence windfall. But in the early 2000s, the reckoning was still in the future. In Atlanta, in the early years of the new millennium, Big Meech was at the peak of his power, and he was about to do something that no drug kingpin at his level had ever quite done before. He was about to become famous on purpose. The year 2000 is when the mythology of the Black Mafia family fully crystallized. This is when the acronym BMF began to appear on chains, on clothing, in conversations, in rap lyrics, in the vocabulary of an entire culture. And this is when Big Meech took a step that would define his legacy in ways he perhaps could not have fully anticipated. He launched BMF Entertainment. The concept of using a legitimate business as a front for criminal proceeds is as old as organized crime itself. Money laundering through legitimate businesses, restaurants, car washes, construction companies, entertainment venues, is a standard tool in the criminal enterprise playbook. Big Meech understood this. The entertainment business was a logical choice. It is a cash-intensive industry where large fluctuations in revenue are normal and explainable, where luxury spending is expected and normalized, and where relationships with artists and celebrities create social capital that can open doors in legitimate and illegitimate worlds simultaneously. But BMF Entertainment was never only a money laundering vehicle. Not to Big Meech. To him, the entertainment business was something he genuinely wanted. The world of music, of celebrity, of spectacle, and fame. This was not a cover story. This was an aspiration. Demetrius Flannery had grown up watching the drug dealers around him wield power through visibility. The Chambers brothers, flaunting their money on federal surveillance tapes, had understood that in the world they occupied, the display of wealth was itself a form of power. But Big Meech wanted something the Chambers brothers never achieved. He wanted to be celebrated. He wanted not just the street's respect, but the culture's admiration. He wanted his name on something that would last. BMF Entertainment established itself as a hip-hop promotion company and record label. The label's primary signed artist was a rapper named Blue Da Vinci. a Detroit-born MC who would later claim he had no knowledge of the criminal underpinnings of the label, though a court would eventually sentence him to 5 years in prison for his time with the organization. But BMF Entertainment's reach extended far beyond its one signed artist. What Big Meech actually did with BMF Entertainment was something that positioned him at the center of Atlanta's, and therefore the nation's, hip-hop culture. He became a promoter. He threw parties. Lavish, enormous, invitation-only events at Atlanta's top nightclubs, Compound, Club Crucial, and others that became legendary throughout the city. These were not ordinary parties. They were productions. Hundreds of people, oceans of champagne, VIP sections that cost more to occupy for a single night than most Atlantans earned in a year. And Big Meech himself at the center of it all, enormous in his personality, magnetic in his presence, the kind of man whose entrance into a room caused every other conversation to pause. He was also, critically, connected with the most important figures in hip-hop at a moment when hip-hop was becoming the dominant cultural and commercial force in American music. The Flannery brothers had, through their wealth and lifestyle, been socializing with music industry figures for years. But in the early 2000s, Big Meech elevated this to a systematic effort to make BMF the most visible brand in the culture. He befriended and hosted legends. Sean Diddy Combs, the most commercially powerful figure in hip-hop at the time, was in Meech's orbit. Jacob the Jeweler Arabo, the New York jeweler to the rap world's elite, became a direct business associate of the BMF. The connection to Jacob the Jeweler was not just social, it was financial. Jacob Arabo was eventually indicted in 2006, in part because of his dealings with the BMF, accused of laundering money for the organization through his jewelry business. But the most significant and celebrated relationship that Big Meech cultivated during this era was with a young Atlanta rapper named J. Wayne Jenkins, known to the world as Young Jeezy. The story of Big Meech and Young Jeezy is one of the most fascinating and complex relationships in the entire BMF saga. Jeezy was, in the early 2000s, a street rapper from Atlanta who was beginning to attract serious attention in the local hip-hop community. His music was raw, autobiographical, and carried the credibility of a man who had actually lived what he was rapping about. He was not yet signed to a major label. He was not yet famous nationally. Big Meech saw something in Jeezy. According to multiple accounts, Meech believed in Jeezy before the world at large did, and he uses enormous resources and connections to help elevate Jeezy's profile in Atlanta. He threw parties to promote Jeezy's music. He supplied fancy cars and the kind of enormous diamond medallion pendants that defined the visual vocabulary of mid-2000s trap music for Jeezy's video shoots. He got Jeezy's music into the Atlanta strip clubs, which in that era was one of the most powerful promotional mechanisms available to a southern rap artist. If your song was playing in the strip clubs, your song was being heard by everyone who mattered. Jeezy was open about his relationship with Big Meech in interviews and in his music. He shouted out the Black Mafia Family in promotional videos. The relationship was visible, celebrated, and close. Later, when speaking about Meech in interviews, Jeezy described a man operating on a scale that seemed almost impossible. Private planes, millions of dollars a week moving through his hands, celebrities on speed dial. Literally, when I asked Meech about the high point of 15 or 20 years at the top of the drug game, author Morris Shalhope wrote, after speaking with Big Meech directly, he said the best thing was helping Jeezy's career take off. This is a remarkable statement. A man who had generated an estimated $270 million. A man who owned 13 mansions across the United States. A man who had built one of the largest cocaine distribution networks in American history. And the best thing about all of it, in his own assessment, was helping a rapper he believed in get his music heard. It tells you something profound about what Big Meech actually wanted from the life he had built. The money was never really about the money. It was about the access it provided. The access to the world of culture and celebrity and music and spectacle that was, for him, the real prize. Big Meech also claimed, with the characteristic boldness that defined his public persona, to have played a role in the early careers of other Atlanta rap luminaries, including T.I. These claims are harder to verify and were disputed or unacknowledged by the artists themselves for obvious reasons. But what is not in dispute is that by the early 2000s, Big Meech and the BMF were woven into the fabric of Atlanta's hip-hop world in a way that went far beyond mere social association. They were part of the culture's origin story. BMF Entertainment also posted billboards across Atlanta that read, "The World ISBMFs." This was not a subtle operation. This was a drug kingpin essentially advertising himself to the city, to law enforcement, to everyone with eyes. The boldness was either the ultimate expression of invincibility or the most spectacular miscalculation in the organization's history. Probably, in retrospect, it was both. The BMF logo became an icon. People tattooed it on their skin, wore it on clothing, shouted it in videos. The Black Mafia Family had, by the early 2000s, transformed itself from a drug trafficking organization into something approaching a brand, a culture, a lifestyle, an identity that people outside the organization aspired to associate with. This was unprecedented in American organized crime. The Italian-American Mafia had never cultivated public celebration of its brand in this way. The Mexican cartels operated in darkness, using violence as their primary public relations tool. But Big Meech had found a way to take a criminal organization and turn it into something that a significant portion of American hip-hop culture wanted to celebrate and associate with. The reasons for this are complex and deserving of serious examination. The BMF represented, to many who admired it, the most spectacular possible rejection of a social order that had offered black men from cities like Detroit and Atlanta very little worth accepting. The wealth, the freedom, the power, the celebrity. These things resonated with people who were living in the same circumstances that Demetrius and Terry Flannery had grown up in. The BMF said, "We did not wait for permission. We did not beg for opportunity. We built our own." That this was built on cocaine, on the addiction and destruction of people in their own communities, on violence and intimidation. These costs existed, and they were real. But in the cultural conversation of the early 2000s, they were largely absent from the celebration. Big Meech had made the story of his empire compelling enough to crowd out the story of its consequences. The parties during this era were legendary. Big Meech was known to arrive at nightclubs with entourages of 100 or more people, spending lavish amounts in a single evening. Custom cars, designer wardrobes, diamonds from Jacob the Jeweler, 13 mansions across the country, including properties in Metro Detroit, Georgia, and Los Angeles. A fleet of vehicles that read like a luxury car dealer's inventory, Maybachs, Bentleys, Ferraris, and more. Jeezy once described in interviews how Big Meech would pull up to events in a way that made everyone in the building understand immediately that someone extraordinary had arrived. The presence, the clothing, the entourage, the energy. It was a performance. It was a masterful one. But underneath all the spectacle, the operation was still running. The cocaine was still moving. The money was still being laundered. The hierarchy was still functioning, with lieutenants managing territories and workers moving product and cash across state lines. The party was real. The business was real. And the government was watching. By the early 2000s, one of the most consequential and least publicly discussed developments in the BMF story was unfolding quietly. The deterioration of the relationship between Demetrius and Terry Flannery, the brothers who had started together on a Detroit street corner with nothing but ambition, and each other had grown into two very different men. And those differences were beginning to create tension that the organization could not entirely contain. The differences were not simply about personality, though personality was part of it. They were about fundamental disagreements regarding how to run the operation, specifically about the level of visibility that was appropriate for men in their position. Terry Flannery, Southwest T, had always been the quiet one, the operational mind, the man who understood that in the business they were in, invisibility was survival. He ran the Los Angeles hub efficiently, and without the spectacle that defined his brother's Atlanta operation. Where Big Meech was filling nightclubs and put his name on billboards, Southwest T was managing logistics, overseeing supply chains, and maintaining the kind of low profile that career criminals with survival instincts tend to favor. Demetrius, by contrast, had become increasingly, almost defiantly, visible. The BMF Entertainment venture, the celebrity connections, the billboards, the parties, the entourage, the constant public presence. For a man who was a co-founder of a major cocaine trafficking organization, Big Meech was living in a way that made law enforcement's job almost embarrassingly easy. They did not need undercover agents to find him. They just needed to watch who was at the hottest parties in Atlanta. Terry reportedly believed that his brother's visibility was catastrophically dangerous, that the attention Big Meech was attracting from the culture, from the press, from the celebrities, was the same attention that eventually brought down every high-profile criminal organization, that the difference between long-term survival and a federal indictment was directly proportional to how much you let the world see you. Big Meech, for his part, seemed to have believed, at least for a while, that his cultural cachet actually provided a form of protection, that being beloved by the hip-hop community, by celebrities, by the media, made him somehow harder to touch, that the brand of BMF was armor. He was wrong, but the belief was coherent in a way. The federal government does not typically pursue beloved cultural icons with the same vigor it pursues anonymous criminals. Public attention can sometimes be a tool. The problem was that Big Meech was not using his public attention strategically. He was genuinely intoxicated by it. The celebrity was not a shield. It was a light. And in the darkness of criminal enterprise, light is never your friend. There was also, by the early 2000s, growing concern within the organization about internal security. The larger an organization grows, the more people know things they should not know, the more potential informants exist, the more opportunities law enforcement has to flip someone at the lower levels and work their way up. BMF had over 500 members, 500 people. Each of them knew something. Many of them knew enough to be enormously valuable to federal prosecutors. And the DEA, by this point, was already building a case. The split between the brothers is described in various accounts as having become serious enough that they were, by the early 2000s, barely speaking to each other, not formally dissolving the organization. The operation still ran, but operated with increasing independence from each other, with the East and West Coast hubs functioning more like separate enterprises sharing a supply chain than like a unified organization under unified leadership. This division would have operational consequences. Unity is the most important structural protection any criminal organization has. When the people at the top of a hierarchy are not aligned, the signals they send down to the organization become mixed. Loyalty is divided. Decision-making slows. And the vulnerabilities that law enforcement needs to exploit become harder to paper over. The split between Big Meech and Southwest T did not bring down the BMF, but it weakened it, and weakness, in the federal government's crosshairs, was exactly the wrong thing to show. There were also incidents of violence that increased law enforcement scrutiny during this period. On June 5, 2003, a shooting occurred outside Chaos, an Atlanta nightclub. Multiple people were shot. The incident drew attention to the BMF's presence in Atlanta's nightclub scene and put names on law enforcement radar. In 2004, Big Meech himself was shot in the buttocks during a shooting outside an Atlanta nightclub. The incident arose from an altercation with Anthony Wolf Jones, a former bodyguard for Sean Diddy Combs. Jones was killed in the altercation. Big Meech was wounded. The investigation that followed this incident generated additional intelligence for federal investigators who were already building their case. And on July 11, 2004, a date that would later be cited as particularly significant in the federal investigation, Terry Flannery was arrested in Illinois during a traffic stop and was found in possession of approximately $4 million worth of jewelry. He was personally transporting the jewelry to Young Jeezy for a music video photo shoot. The jewelry seizure led to a money laundering investigation that swept in not only Terry, but also music producer Damon Thomas, who happened to be Kim Kardashian's first husband, and Jacob the jeweler. Every incident, every arrest, every seizure was giving federal investigators more names, more evidence, more of the organizational map that they needed to prosecute not just street-level members, but the men at the very top. The clock was ticking. And in October 2003, the DA had formally started it. October 28, 2003. This is the date that, in retrospect, marked the formal beginning of the end for Black Mafia Family. On this day, a 2-year organized crime drug enforcement task force investigation was officially launched, coordinated by the DEA's Special Operations Division. The operation was named with a certain federal flair for drama, Operation Motor City Mafia. The agencies involved were formidable: the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Michigan, state and local law enforcement partners in multiple cities and states. These were not the narcotics detectives who worked street-level drug cases. The DEA Special Operations Division, the unit coordinating the investigation, was the same unit that coordinated intelligence operations against major international drug trafficking organizations. The unit that went after Mexican cartels and Colombian cocaine networks. The message of assigning this unit to the BMF case was not subtle. The federal government had concluded that the Black Mafia Family was operating at a level that warranted the same tools used against international trafficking organizations. Because, in substance, the investigation proceeded to the standard architecture of a sophisticated federal organized crime case. Wiretaps on telephone communications, monitored, recorded, and analyzed over months and years. Surveillance of physical locations, distribution hubs, meeting places, residences. Undercover operations in which federal agents gathered intelligence while operating within the BMF orbit or associated communities. Informants, low-level members and associates who were arrested on related charges and offered reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation and information about the organization's structure and leadership. The 900-page report that would eventually emerge from this investigation, wiretap transcripts, informant testimonies, seized financial records, surveillance photographs, and analytical work by federal intelligence analysts, represented an enormous investment of federal resources over a period of years. It was, by any measure, one of the most comprehensive investigations into a domestic drug trafficking organization in DEA history. The lead-up to the final raids in October 2005 had already produced significant seizures. Prior to the main operation, DEA and state and local authorities had arrested 17 BMF members and associates, seized 632 kilograms of cocaine, $5.3 million in United States currency, and $5.7 million in other assets. Each of these seizures gave investigators more intelligence. Each arrested member was a potential source of information about those above them in the hierarchy. The April 2004 seizure of the Jabari Hayes motorhome, with its 95 kilograms of cocaine, was a particularly significant intelligence milestone. Hayes was a BMF courier and high-level distributor. His arrest provided investigators with detailed information about BMF's transportation methods, supply chain logistics, and the organizational structure of the delivery network. By 2004 and 2005, federal investigators had assembled a picture of the BMF that was detailed enough to support prosecution of the organization's leadership under the most powerful statute in the federal organized crime toolkit, the Continuing Criminal Enterprise Statute, sometimes called the Drug Kingpin Statute. This law was designed specifically to prosecute the leadership of major drug trafficking organizations, not just individual transactions, not just individual possessions, but the act of organizing, managing, and supervising a continuing series of criminal drug transactions. A conviction under the CCE carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. In cases involving the scale of the BMF, prosecutors were aiming significantly higher. The wiretaps that investigators were running during this period were capturing extraordinary things. Conversations between BMF members discussing shipments, prices, distribution arrangements, and organizational matters. Conversations that place specific individuals in specific roles within the organization's hierarchy. Conversations that would eventually become some of the most damaging evidence at trial. And there was the matter of the BMF's own visibility. Big Meech's public persona, the parties, the celebrity connections, the BMF Entertainment brand, the billboards, create a trail of documentation that no self-respecting federal investigator could fail to follow. When you post billboards saying the World ISBMFs across a major American city, you have handed your prosecutors an enormous gift. You have told the world, and therefore the government, exactly what you think you are. The federal case also benefited from a series of incidents that pulled additional figures into the investigation. The July 2004 jewelry seizure involving Terry Flannery, Damon Thomas, and Jacob the Jeweler created new threads. The 2005 shooting incident outside an Atlanta club involving young Jeezy and alleged BMF associates. Jeezy was arrested on March 11, 2006, in connection with an incident in Miami, though he was never convicted of drug-related charges. Created additional investigative connections. Charles Barkley and Michael Jordan, two of the most famous athletes in American sports history, were at one point questioned as part of the federal investigation because of their dealings with BMF associate named Tremaine Kiki Graham. The details of what exactly those dealings were remain murky, and neither athlete was accused of any wrongdoing. But the fact that the investigation's tentacles reached into the orbit of Hall of Fame basketball players speaks to the extraordinary breadth of the social world that Big Meech had built around the BMF. NFL star Adam "Pac-Man" Jones was connected to the case through his alleged financing of the legal defense of a high-ranking BMF member named Fleming Ill Daniels during Daniels' drug trafficking trial. Again, Pac-Man Jones was not prosecuted for drug trafficking, but his name appeared in the investigation's records. The BMF had achieved something that almost no criminal organization in American history had achieved. It had inserted itself into the social orbits of entertainment, sports, and business at the highest levels. By late 2005, federal investigators had everything they needed. The case was built. The evidence was in place. The organizational map was drawn. The wiretaps were compiled. The informants were in position. And on October 28, 2005, exactly 2 years to the day after Operation Motor City Mafia officially began, the DA made its move. October 28, 2005, the anniversary of Operation Motor City Mafia's launch, was not a coincidence. Federal investigators, with the theatrical precision that major operations sometimes involve, chose this date deliberately. 2 years of work. 2 years of wiretaps and surveillance and informants and seized shipments. And now the final act. The raids were coordinated across multiple cities simultaneously. Atlanta, Detroit, Los Angeles, St. Louis, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Orlando, Greenville, South Carolina, Columbus, Georgia, Louisville, Kentucky, every major BMF hub, every significant distribution point, every city where the organization had planted its flag. The federal government came through the door at the same moment. In Frisco, Texas, a suburb outside of Dallas, federal agents descended on a large residential property where Big Meech had been staying. Demetrius Flannery, the co-founder and face of the Black Mafia Family, the man who had been the most visible drug kingpin in America for years, was arrested without significant incident. The empire's most recognizable face was in handcuffs. Southwest T was arrested in St. Louis, Missouri. In the initial raid, 30 BMF members and associates were arrested. Federal agents seized $3 million in cash and assets, 2.5 kilograms of cocaine on hand at the time of the raids, and numerous weapons. When combined with the seizures from the preceding 2 years of investigations, the total picture of what the federal government had accumulated was staggering. Over 630 kilograms of cocaine, more than $5.3 million in cash, more than $5.7 million in other assets. 13 homes across Metro Detroit, Georgia, and Los Angeles. More than 3 dozen vehicles. Jewelry worth millions. Financial records documenting the laundering of drug proceeds through BMF Entertainment and other business fronts. According to later accounts, including the detailed reporting in Mara Shalhope's book BMF, The Rise and Fall of Big Meech and Black Mafia Family, which was published in 2010 and remains the most comprehensive journalistic account of the organization. The BMF had been aware that the federal government was closing in before the October 2005 raids. Southwest T's arrest had come first, or near simultaneously, depending on the account. And there are documented reports that Big Meech had been offered the opportunity to flee to Mexico to avoid capture. Given his connections to Mexican cartel sources, this was not an empty option. Mexico would have been accessible, and avoiding a federal indictment would have meant remaining free. Big Meech chose to stay. The reasons for this decision have never been fully explained. Perhaps he did not believe the case against him was as strong as it proved to be. Perhaps the idea of exile, of giving up the life he had built, the celebrity, the cultural status, the possibility of the music industry future he dreamed of, was more intolerable than the alternative. Perhaps he believed that his lawyers could fight and win. Perhaps he simply, at the end, was not the kind of man who ran. Whatever the reason, he was arrested. And when the smoke cleared on October 28, 2005, the Black Mafia Family, the organization that had been built over 2 decades, from $50 bags on a Detroit street corner to a $270 million cocaine empire spanning 11 states, was over. DEA Administrator Karen Tandy issued a public statement after the raids. For too many years, these drug dealers have poisoned our streets and cast shadows of fear across our communities. Today's arrest dismantled this drug mob and should significantly impact drug-related crime in the communities where the BMF operated. The statement was accurate, but it was also incomplete, because the story of the Black Mafia family did not end on October 28, 2005. In a way, in the cultural way, the pop culture way, the way that names become legends, it had barely begun. The arrests were the dramatic headline. But the legal machinery that followed was where the government's full case against the Flannery brothers came into focus. Following the October 2005 raids, federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of Michigan, the jurisdiction chosen because the BMF had originated in Detroit, began the process of constructing the formal criminal case. The charges were formidable. Both Demetrius and Terry Flannery were charged with the most serious offenses available under federal law for drug trafficking organizations. The charge list included violations of the continuing criminal enterprise statute, the drug kingpin law designed specifically for the leaders of major trafficking organizations, conspiracy to distribute 5 kilograms or more cocaine, possession with intent to distribute more than 500 grams of cocaine, conspiracy to launder monetary instruments, multiple counts of possession with intent to distribute more than 5 kilograms of cocaine. The continuing criminal enterprise charge alone carried mandatory minimums that would keep both men in federal prison for the rest of their working lives. If convicted at trial, the government was not offering a way out. The case was built to be devastating. The indictment detailed the full scope of what prosecutors alleged: a continuing criminal enterprise involving the large-scale distribution of cocaine throughout the United States from 1990 through 2005. Not a few transactions, not a brief period of activity. 15 years of organized, systematic cocaine trafficking, moving from street-level dealing in Detroit to a multi-state empire with direct connections to Mexican drug cartels and revenues estimated at $270 million. Additional indictments followed in 2007 against 16 associates in Georgia, alleging violent enforcement of the drug distribution network, including assaults and intimidation to protect territory. Federal prosecutors were building a RICO-style case, establishing not just the drug trafficking but the pattern of related criminal activity that characterized a sustained criminal enterprise. The evidence presented during legal proceedings was comprehensive. Wiretap recordings of drug deals and organizational conversations. Seized financial ledgers documenting transactions and money flows. The testimony of cooperating witnesses. Former BMF members who had been arrested in earlier seizures and agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences. Surveillance photographs. Records of the business fronts used for money laundering. Financial analysis showing the movement of drug proceeds through BMF Entertainment and other ostensibly legitimate businesses. The role of BMF Entertainment as a money laundering vehicle was examined in detail. The record label and promotion company had provided a veneer of legitimacy for the lavish spending that characterized BMF's lifestyle. When federal investigators traced the money flowing through BMF Entertainment, they found drug proceeds being laundered through record label expenses, promotion costs, party expenses, and artist development budgets. The cocaine money was being washed through the music industry, transformed, on paper, into legitimate entertainment expenses. Jacob the jeweler, Jacob Arabo, the New York jeweler whose client list read, like a who's who of hip-hop royalty, was indicted in 2006 in connection with his dealings with the BMF. He was accused of laundering money for the organization through his jewelry business, helping transform drug cash into diamonds and precious metals. Arabo eventually pleaded guilty to money laundering charges and was sentenced to federal prison. As the case progressed through 2006 and 2007, the full weight of what the federal government had accumulated became clear. The 900 pages of wiretap material alone represented a staggering volume of documented criminal activity. The financial records, the informant testimony, the surveillance documentation. Together, they painted a picture of an organization that had operated with extraordinary sophistication and scale for 15 years. Big Meech and Southwest T had lawyers. Good ones. But the case against them was not a case that could be defeated by attacking the evidence. The evidence was too comprehensive and too well documented. The question was not whether they had done what the government alleged. The question was what their fate would be. In November 2007, after months of negotiations, both Demetrius and Terry Flannery entered guilty pleas. They admitted to running a continuing criminal enterprise involving the large-scale distribution of cocaine throughout the United States from 1990 through 2005. The pleas were a formal acknowledgement of everything the government had alleged: the scale, the duration, the leadership. The sentencing was scheduled, and the country waited. September 2008, the Eastern District of Michigan Federal Courthouse in Detroit, the city where it all started, where two teenagers with holes in their shoes had first imagined something bigger than everything around them. United States District Judge David M. Lawson presided over the sentencing of Demetrius Edward Flannery and Terry Lee Flannery. The proceeding was not a trial. The guilty pleas had already been entered. What the sentencing hearing determined was the length and terms of the punishment. The federal sentencing guidelines for convictions under the continuing criminal enterprise statute, given the scale of the operation and the quantities of cocaine involved, left limited flexibility. The government asked for severe sentences. The defense argued for consideration of factors that might warrant some reduction. The judge heard both sides. When Judge Lawson imposed sentence, it was the same for both brothers. 30 years in federal prison, 360 months. For Demetrius Flannery, born June 21, 1968, a 30-year sentence meant he would not be eligible for release until he was nearly 70 years old. For Terry Flannery, the younger brother, the math was similar. The DEA special agent in charge, Robert Corso, issued a statement after sentencing that articulated the government's view of what the BMF had been and what its destruction meant. The BMF was a violent, sophisticated drug smuggling and money laundering organization that began right here in Detroit, Michigan. Terry and Demetrius Flannery expanded what was a small local operation into a multi-state, multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise with direct links to Mexican-based drug trafficking cartels. The statement was clinical. It described the organization accurately: the violence, the sophistication, the scale, the cartel connections. What it did not describe, because it was not the government's job to describe it, was the human texture of what had been dismantled. The two boys from the Southwest Side, the parents who had tried, the brother who had been shot in the eye, the other brother who had survived being shot in the neck. The 15 years of building something that, whatever its cost communities and individuals, had required a kind of genius to construct. Blue Da Vinci, the BMF Entertainment rapper, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his association with the organization. He was released in 2011. Various BMF members and associates received sentences of their own, ranging from months to decades, depending on their role in the organization and whether they had cooperated with federal investigators. The BMF was gone. The cocaine supply chain was dismantled. The Atlanta hub was shuttered. The Los Angeles operation was closed. The 13 mansions were seized. The fleet of luxury vehicles was confiscated. The jewelry was taken. The BMF Entertainment offices were empty. The billboards that had declared the world BMFs were taken down. All that remained for a time was the silence and the memory. Federal prison is not the county jail. Federal prison for a man serving 30 years under a continuing criminal enterprise conviction means a facility that the Bureau of Prisons classifies based on security level, distance from family, and a variety of factors that the prisoner has very little control over. It means decades measured in seasons of visiting days and phone calls. And, if you are Big Meech, the strange experience of watching your legend grow on the outside, while your world on the inside shrinks to the dimensions of a cell. Big Meech was initially housed at FCI Yazoo City in Mississippi, before eventually being transferred to FCI Coleman Low in Wildwood, Florida. The federal prison system moves inmates, and Meech was moved multiple times over the course of his incarceration. What is remarkable about the prison years? Remarkable, and depending on your perspective, either admirable or infuriating, is how actively Big Meech worked to maintain his presence in the culture from behind bars. Federal prison calls are recorded. Federal prison correspondence is monitored. None of this stopped Demetrius Flenory from conducting interviews, from communicating with the hip-hop world, from maintaining the persona of Big Meech even when Big Meech was a federal prisoner in a low-security facility in Florida. From prison, he gave interviews. He made statements that were published and circulated. He communicated with his son, Demetrius Flenory Jr., known as Lil Meech, who was growing up in the shadow of his father's legend and preparing, in ways neither of them could have anticipated in 2008, to play a significant role in how that legend was eventually told to the world. Federal prosecutors, in court filings related to Big Meech's attempts to have his sentence reduced or to be released early, were explicit about their frustration with his continued cultivation of his image. Assistant United States Attorney Dawn Eisen wrote in a court filing, "During his time in prison, Flenory continues to promote himself and, through others, his legacy as a highly successful professional drug dealer. Nothing in that promotion remotely suggests that Flenory has changed." This statement captures the fundamental tension of the Big Meech prison years. From the government's perspective, a man who continues to celebrate his drug-dealing legacy while serving time for drug dealing has not demonstrated remorse or rehabilitation. From Big Meech's perspective, and from the perspective of the culture that had built him into a legend, the legend was not separate from the man. It was the man. It was what he had built, and he was not prepared to disclaim it. Southwest T, serving his concurrent 30-year sentence, maintained a lower profile in prison, consistent with the personality that had always defined him relative to his brother. While Big Meech was calling from prison and maintaining his cultural presence, Terry Flenory was largely silent. The two brothers who had barely been speaking to each other at the end of the BMF's operational life were now serving parallel time in separate federal facilities. The years passed. Hip-hop changed. The cities that BMF had operated in changed. Atlanta continued its rise as a capital of global hip-hop culture. The city that had once been the center of BMF's empire was now the home of Drake's recording sessions, of trap music's complete dominance of popular culture, of the next generation of rap stars who had grown up with the legend of Big Meech as part of the soundtrack of their ambition. In the streets and in the studios, the name BMF had taken on a life that was entirely independent of the federal case records. It was shorthand for a particular kind of ambition, the kind that recognizes no ceiling, that refuses to accept the terms offered by a world that was never designed to include you. Rick Ross's famous lyric, "I think I'm Big Meech, Larry Hoover," captured something that the culture had decided about Demetrius Flenory. He was an archetype, a symbol, a name that meant something beyond the specific facts of cocaine trafficking and federal prosecution. Young Jeezy, who had built an enormously successful career after his association with BMF, never fully addressed the relationship publicly in the way that investigators and journalists tried to get him to. But the connection was permanent, part of both men's origin stories, part of the mythology of early 2000s Atlanta hip-hop that no amount of discretion could erase. The COVID-19 pandemic, which arrived in early 2020 and swept the federal prison system with devastating speed, would eventually produce the first major legal development in the Flenory brothers' post-conviction story. March 2020. COVID-19 arrived in the United States with a speed that overwhelmed every institution the country had. Hospitals were overwhelmed, supply chains buckled, and in federal prisons, where people are housed in close proximity with limited access to medical care, the virus spread with particular ferocity. The federal prison population is not, by design, a population that attracts a great deal of public concern. But the conditions in federal facilities during the COVID-19 pandemic were genuinely alarming, and advocates for federal prisoners, both civil liberties organizations and families of incarcerated people, pressed hard for the Bureau of Prisons and federal courts to use available legal tools to reduce the prison population, particularly for older prisoners with underlying health conditions who were at elevated risk of severe COVID illness. Terry Lee Flenory, Southwest T, was in his early 50s. He had been incarcerated since 2005. He had served approximately 15 years of a 30-year sentence. and he was among the prisoners whose attorneys argued presented elevated health risk in the pandemic environment. In May 2020, Terry Flenory was released to home confinement. The compassionate release was consistent with a broader initiative by the Bureau of Prisons during the pandemic to transfer certain prisoners out of facilities and into home confinement, where they would still be under supervision, but would not be subject to the infection risks of institutional confinement. For the Flenory family, the release of Southwest T was a moment of enormous significance, not just practically, but emotionally. He had served 15 years. He had been away from his family, from the world, from freedom, since 2005. And while his release was conditional, home confinement is not freedom in the unconditional sense. He was out. He was alive. He was home. The contrast with his brother was stark. Big Meech's attorneys had also applied for compassionate release during the pandemic, citing the same elevated health risks. The applications were denied. Not once, not twice, but 4 separate times. The federal courts declined to release Big Meech to home confinement during the pandemic. The reasons given in the court filings included the assistant U.S. attorney's arguments about Big Meech's continued promotion of his drug-dealing legacy from prison, an argument that the government believed demonstrated insufficient rehabilitation to warrant early release. The difference in outcomes for the two brothers was not lost on anyone who had been following the story. Southwest T, who had always operated with more restraint and less public visibility than his brother, was released. Big Meech, who had spent his prison years maintaining his public persona with the same dedication he had brought to maintaining it on the outside, was denied. The lesson was one that Big Meech had been unable or unwilling to absorb throughout his career. Visibility has costs. In the world of drug trafficking, visibility had been a choice that ultimately made him easier to prosecute. In the world of federal prison, his visibility, his insistence on maintaining the Big Meech brand even from behind bars, had become an argument that prosecutors used to keep him there. Later, President Joe Biden would grant Terry Flenory a presidential commutation, a formal act of executive clemency, as part of a broader initiative to permanently reduce the sentences of people who had been released from federal prison to home confinement during the COVID-19 pandemic. The commutation transformed Southwest T's status from temporary home confinement back to federal sentence into a permanent reduction of his sentence. He was, finally, free in a real and permanent sense. Southwest T celebrated the moment publicly on Instagram, posting a photo of his clemency affidavit alongside videos of himself cutting off his house arrest monitoring device. His caption read, "It's been a journey, but prayer and unwavering faith beyond mere human comprehension got us to this point." The journey had been 40 years from the southwest side of Detroit to that moment. 40 years from two brothers selling $50 bags of cocaine to one of those brothers cutting off a federal ankle monitor on camera, free for the first time since 2005. For Big Meech, the journey was not over, but it was approaching its own conclusion. While Southwest T was navigating his path to freedom, Demetrius Flenory was working the legal system from the inside. The federal sentencing guidelines that had been used to sentence Big Meech in 2008 had not remained static in the years since. One of the persistent criticisms of the federal drug sentencing regime is that the sentences imposed under the continuing criminal enterprise statute and related drug quantity guidelines have historically been extraordinarily long, longer, critics argue, than is necessary for either deterrence or justice, and producing incarceration costs and human costs that dwarf any proportionate social benefit. The United States Sentencing Commission, which sets the guidelines that federal courts use in imposing sentences, periodically revises those guidelines in response to evidence, policy debates, and legislative direction. Among the most significant revisions in recent years were Amendments 782 and 788, which revised the drug quantity table used to calculate sentences in drug trafficking cases, specifically reducing the offense level for drug quantity by 2 levels across the board, which translates into meaningfully shorter sentences for the same quantity of drugs. These amendments were made retroactive, meaning that people already serving sentences calculated under the old guidelines could apply for reductions under the new ones. Big Meech applied. His attorneys argued that he met the criteria for a sentence reduction under USSG Amendments 782 and 788. United States District Judge David M. Lawson, the same judge who had presided over his original sentencing, agreed. In June 2021, Judge Lawson reduced Big Meech's 360-month sentence to 324 months. 30 years had become 27 years. The projected release date, which had been approximately 2031, moved to approximately 2028. This was significant. 3 fewer years is 3 fewer years. But it was not the dramatic change that Big Meech's supporters had been hoping for. Celebrities and public figures, including 50 Cent and LL Cool J, had publicly called for Big Meech to be pardoned outright, arguing that his continued incarceration served no useful purpose and that the sentence was disproportionate to the offense. Federal prosecutors responded to these calls in court filings with the argument that a man who continued to promote his drug-dealing legacy from prison had not demonstrated the rehabilitation that would warrant clemency. The public debate about Big Meech's sentence touched on questions that went far beyond his individual case. The racial disparities in federal drug sentencing, the question of whether mandatory minimum sentences for drug trafficking produce outcomes proportionate to the actual harm involved, the role of celebrity and culture in how society thinks about crime and punishment. Big Meech had become, involuntarily, a focal point for arguments that his supporters have been making about the justice system for decades. Then, in early 2024, another significant development. According to reporting by TMZ and later confirmed by the Bureau of Prisons, Big Meech's sentence was cut short by nearly 3 years as part of a broader effort to reform sentencing for nonviolent drug offenders. This further reduction brought a projected release date to January 27, 2026. And then on October 15, 2024, the date that set off celebrations across social media and across the communities that followed his story for decades, Demetrius Big Meech Flannery was transferred from FCI Coleman Low in Wildwood, Florida, to a halfway house in Miami, Florida. The Bureau of Prisons confirmed the transfer to TMZ. He was in a residential reentry program, not yet fully free. The conditions of his release would eventually include a supervised release period of 5 years following his release date, but he was out of the federal correctional facility. He was in Miami. He could see the ocean. The celebrations online were immediate and intense. Social media flooded with tributes, congratulations, and declarations of support for a man who had spent nearly 2 decades in federal prison and remained, despite everything, one of the most celebrated figures in hip-hop culture. His projected full release date was January 27, 2026, which means that by the time you are watching this video, Demetrius Flannery may well be a free man. Images emerged of Big Meech after his transfer, looking healthy, showing off new dental work, smiling. The image of him outside prison walls, alive and present in the world, was for many people who had followed his story the culmination of a decades-long narrative. The question of what Big Meech does with his freedom, whether he pursues a music industry career he always dreamed of, whether he becomes an advocate for prison reform and criminal justice change, whether he builds something legitimate with the intelligence and presence that build an empire, remains open. History will record the answer. While the Flannery brothers were navigating their legal situations from 2008 onward, something was happening in the culture that neither of them could have fully predicted. Their story was becoming one of the most commercially and critically compelling narratives in American popular culture. The BMF legend had been growing for years through informal channels, fan-made documentaries, interviews with associates, social media tributes, the constant references in hip-hop lyrics, from Rick Ross's famous verse to dozens of lesser-known but no less heartfelt acknowledgments by rappers who had grown up with the BMF story as part of their musical DNA. In July 2019, it was officially announced that Curtis 50 Cent Jackson had begun developing a television series about the Black Mafia family for the premium cable and streaming network Starz. 50 Cent's company, G-Unit Films and Television Incorporated, in partnership with Lionsgate Television, would produce the series. 50 Cent would serve as executive producer. The choice of 50 Cent as the driving creative force behind the BMF television adaptation was, from a cultural standpoint, almost too perfect. 50 Cent had spent the 2000s as one of the most commercially dominant figures in hip-hop, and his connection to the world that Big Meech had inhabited, the intersection of street credibility and spectacular success, was genuine. He had already created the Starz drama Power, which dramatized the story of a New York drug dealer trying to go legitimate, and its related spin-off universe. which had become enormously successful. The BMF project was, in many ways, a natural extension of the storytelling territory 50 Cent had already staked out. In April 2020, Starz officially greenlit the series. Detroit screenwriter Randy Huggins was brought in to develop the scripts. Huggins, who had grown up in Detroit and had a deep personal connection to the culture and history the show would explore, was the ideal choice. Someone who understood the geography, the culture, the specific texture of life in Southwest Detroit in the 1980s. The casting of the central role, Demetrius Big Meech Flannery, was made with an audacity that matched the spirit of the subject. The role was given to Demetrius Lil Meech Flannery Jr., Big Meech's real-life son, who had never acted professionally before. The decision was either inspired or reckless, depending on your perspective. In the event, it turned out to be inspired. Lil Meech, who had grown up with the legend of his father as a constant presence in his life, brought to the role an authenticity and emotional depth that no professional actor could have manufactured. The show also included Eminem in a significant recurring role, playing Richard White Boy Rick Wares Jr., a white teenage drug informant who had become entangled with Detroit's drug world in the 1980s, and whose story had its own separate pop culture profile. Eminem's participation in the show, playing a character from his own hometown's history, was one of the more remarkable casting choices in recent television memory. BMF premiered on Starz on September 26, 2021. The response was immediate and substantial. The show drew large audiences and generated significant cultural conversation, particularly in the hip-hop community and among audiences who had any connection to the story's historical background. Reviews were mixed in a way that all prestige crime dramas received mixed reviews. Some critics found the show occasionally melodramatic. Others praised its authentic rendering of the Detroit and Atlanta environments of the 1980s and 1990s. The show was also accompanied by a documentary series, the BMF documentary, Blowing Money Fast, which Starz released in 2022. The documentary provided historical context for the narrative dramatized in the scripted series, and included interviews with figures who had been part of the BMF story. The series has now run to 4 seasons, with Season 4 premiering on June 6, 2025. Each season has followed the Flannery brothers' story through different phases: the Detroit origins, the Atlanta expansion, the period of peak power and cultural influence, and the mounting legal pressure that led to the empire's fall. The creative choices made by the show have not been without controversy. Critics have noted that BMF, the television series, tends to emphasize the aspirational and spectacular aspects of the Flannery brothers' story: the ambition, the family loyalty, the cultural achievement, while giving less screen time to the devastation that their cocaine trafficking wrought on the communities they operated in, the people who became addicted to the cocaine that BMF distributed, the violence that accompanied the protection and enforcement of territory, the families damaged by the operation's presence in their neighborhoods. These criticisms are fair, and they reflect a genuine tension in any dramatization of criminal enterprise. The story of how someone builds an empire is, by its dramatic nature, a story of agency and achievement, even when what is being built is a cocaine distribution network. The television apparatus that transforms true crime stories into entertainment has structural incentives to emphasize the parts of those stories that are exciting and compelling, and to minimize the parts that are complicated and tragic. But the show also reflects something real about how the culture has chosen to remember the Black Mafia family. The BMF was not remembered primarily as a tragedy. It was remembered as a phenomenon, an achievement, a story about 2 brothers from nothing who built something enormous. The moral accounting for what that something cost, in addiction, in violence, in lives shortened or destroyed, happens alongside the celebration, but it does not displace it. This is a complicated cultural legacy of the Black Mafia family, and it is a legacy that BMF, the television show, both reflects and perpetuates. Beyond the courtrooms and the prison cells and the streaming platforms, there's a question that is harder to answer but more important than any of the legal or biographical facts. What does the Black Mafia family mean? What does it mean to a generation of people in Atlanta and Detroit and across urban America who grew up with the BMF legend as part of their cultural inheritance? What does it mean to the hip-hop artists who have referenced it, celebrated it, and drawn from it for going on 3 decades? What does it mean in the context of American history, of racial inequality, of the war on drugs, of the politics of criminalization and punishment? These are not simple questions, and they do not have simple answers. But they are the questions that the BMF story demands. Start with what the BMF represented at the moment of its peak power in the early 2000s. For young black men in cities across America who felt, with some justification, that the legitimate pathways to wealth and status were systematically closed to them, the BMF was proof that the closed door could be circumvented, not through the proper channels. Not by waiting for a system that had never prioritized your inclusion to suddenly include you, but through intelligence, ambition, hustle, and the willingness to operate in the spaces a legitimate economy had left empty. This is a complicated thing to celebrate. The spaces the BMF operated in were not simply markets that the legitimate economy had failed to serve. They were spaces where cocaine flowed into communities and destroyed lives. The BMF was not just a business that refused to accept the rules of legitimate commerce. It was a business whose product, cocaine, caused addiction, violence, family destruction, and death in the communities where it operated. Big Meech was not unaware of this. He was not a man without empathy or consciousness. In various interviews and public statements over the years, he has acknowledged the costs of what he built without fully confronting them. The celebration of the BMF legend in hip-hop culture has similarly tended to bracket the question of consequences, to focus on the achievement without accounting for the price. But the celebration persists, and it persists for reasons that are not simply about moral failure or cultural irresponsibility. The celebration persists because the story of the Flannery brothers touches something real about the experience of poverty and exclusion, and the hunger for dignity that characterizes the lives of many people for whom the BMF legend resonates. Big Meech once said, in a moment of crystalline clarity, "We gotta do something, fast." That sentence, "we gotta do something, fast," is the distillation of an entire experience of American poverty, not the patient poverty of people who believe that if they wait long enough, the system will eventually provide for them. The impatient, urgent poverty of people who have watched everyone around them wait and fail. People who have decided that fast is the only option because slow is a sentence. The drug war that the federal government was prosecuting during the era of the BMF was itself a contested and controversial policy. Critics, including many prominent economists, public health experts, criminologists, and civil rights advocates, argued for years and continue to argue that the mandatory minimum sentencing regime that produced 30-year sentences for drug trafficking organizations did not, in fact, deter drug trafficking or meaningfully reduce cocaine use in America. The demand for cocaine did not disappear when the BMF was dismantled. The Mexican cartels that had supplied the BMF, cartels that, as one federal law enforcement official noted, could wipe their feet on BMF in terms of scale, continue to operate. The drugs continue to flow. The communities that the BMF had served and harmed continue to need and receive cocaine from whoever stepped into the vacuum. What the prosecution of the BMF produced concretely was the incarceration of 2 men for 30 years and the dismantling of an American middleman in the cocaine supply chain. Whether this outcome justified the investment of federal resources and the cost of the Flannery family and the extended BMF community is a question that different people answer differently. And the answer one gives reveals a great deal about one's broader views on criminal justice, the war on drugs, and the purpose of punishment. Hip-hop's embrace of the BMF legend is, in part, a political statement. It is a refusal to accept the government's framing, the framing that says these men were purely villains, purely destroyers, people whose story begins and ends with the harm they caused. The cultural celebration of Big Meech in Southwest T insists on the full human complexity of men whose choices were shaped by circumstances that most of their critics never had to face. This does not mean that the criticism is wrong. The harm was real. The cocaine that BMF moved was real. The addiction it caused was real. The families it damaged were real. Any honest accounting of the BMF's legacy must include these costs alongside the spectacle and the ambition and the family loyalty that make the story so compelling. But the cultural celebration also insists on something that is true and important, that Demetrius and Terry Flannery were not born drug dealers. They were born human beings in circumstances that offered them very little and demanded everything. And what they built, however it was built, and at whatever cost, was genuinely extraordinary. To fully grasp what the Black Mafia family built, it helps to sit with the numbers and let them speak. $270 million. This is a figure that federal prosecutors alleged as the total revenue generated by BMF operations from 1990 through 2005, $270 million in 15 years, by an organization that started with zero in an era before the internet, before the kind of communication and coordination tools that modern businesses take for granted. 2,500 kilograms of cocaine per month through the Atlanta hub alone. To put this in perspective, a kilogram of cocaine is approximately 2.2 pounds. At street retail prices in the early 2000s, a kilogram of cocaine could be broken down and sold for anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 or more, depending on the market. BMF was not selling at retail. They were selling wholesale to distributors. But even at wholesale prices of $17,000 per kilogram, 2,500 kilograms per month, through a single hub represents approximately $42.5 million in monthly revenue from that hub alone. Multiply that across 15 years of operations at varying scale, across multiple hubs and distribution points, account for the fact that the operation grew enormously over time, and the $270 million figure becomes less astonishing than it might initially appear. It becomes, in fact, the obvious mathematical consequence of the scale at which the BMF was operating. The workforce of 500-plus people is equally remarkable. Managing 500 people across multiple states, with the inherent challenges of maintaining discipline, loyalty, and secrecy in an illegal organization, represent an organizational achievement that most legitimate businesses of that size would find difficult to replicate. The fact that the BMF operated at this scale for 15 years without being dismantled earlier is a testament to the organizational discipline that the Flannery brothers, particularly Southwest T, the operational mind, brought to their enterprise. The 13 mansions, more than 36 vehicles, the jewelry from Jacob the Jeweler. These are not just the displays of excess that they might appear beyond the surface. In the world of the BMF, these assets serve multiple purposes simultaneously. They were genuine lifestyle consumption. The brothers genuinely enjoyed and valued these things. They were status signals. In the world they operated in, these displays communicated power and stability to associates and potential partners. And they were also, in certain cases, financial instruments, vehicles for moving and storing value in ways that were harder for authorities to track than cash held in bank accounts. The money laundering operation that ran through BMF Entertainment was sophisticated. Drug cash is difficult to use in legitimate commerce without generating questions about its origin. The money laundering process, using drug cash to fund entertainment company expenses, then generating paper records that made those expenditures appear to be legitimate business costs, was a mechanism that allowed the Flannery brothers to live the lifestyle they lived without immediately triggering the kinds of bank reporting and tax scrutiny that unexplained cash generates. It did not ultimately save them. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division was part of Operation Motor City Mafia for a reason. Financial forensics are extraordinarily powerful, and the 900-page investigative file included detailed financial analysis that traced money flows through BMF Entertainment and other business fronts. But for years, the money laundering infrastructure gave the organization a degree of financial camouflage that bought time. The cocaine supply chain itself was a logistical marvel of a kind that deserves recognition, even as it is condemned. The relationship with Mexican cartel suppliers, managed through California connection established via Wayne Joyner, represented the kind of strategic partnership that any legitimate business would recognize as a key competitive advantage. The transportation network, using luxury vehicles, motorhomes, and other carriers to move product across state lines, was, at its peak, moving quantities of cocaine that dwarf most other domestic trafficking organizations. The distribution network across 11 states, with regional lieutenants managing territories and reporting up through the hierarchy to the brothers at the top, was a genuine organizational structure that maintained coherence across an enormous geographic footprint. None of this excuses what the BMF did. The cocaine they moved did not dissolve harmlessly once it reached its destination. It was consumed by human beings, many of whom became addicted, many of whom had their lives damaged or destroyed by that addiction. The violence that accompanied the protection of territory and the enforcement of the organization's interests caused injury and death. The money laundering that supported the lifestyle corrupted legitimate businesses and institutions. But understanding the scale and sophistication of what the Flannery brothers built is essential to understanding why their story captured the imagination of a culture. This was not ordinary crime. This was, by any honest measure, an extraordinary achievement, achieved through means that were illegal and harmful, yes, but achieved through intelligence, strategy, discipline, and vision that would have built something remarkable in any legal context. The story of the Black Mafia family is usually told as the story of Big Meech and Southwest T, the brothers, the co-founders, the two men whose partnership and eventual estrangement defined the organization's arc. But there is another story embedded within this one that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The story of Charles and Lucille Flannery. Charles and Lucille Flannery were the parents of Demetrius and Terry. They were, by every account that exists in the historical record, genuinely good people, hard-working, religious, devoted to their family. They came from a working-class tradition of city that had built itself on the dignity of industrial labor and was now watching that dignity eroded by forces larger than any individual family could contend with. They raised their boys in a household where the Bible was open, where church was a foundation, where the values they instilled, loyalty, family, hard work, honesty, were genuine and deeply held. And they watched those boys, shaped by those values, take everything those values contained, the loyalty, the family commitment, the work ethic, and pour it all into Black Mafia Family. The Starz television series BMF chose to make this family dynamic central to its narrative. Russell Hornsby and Mike O'Briana White played Charles and Lucille Flannery in the show, and their portrayals capture profound tragedy of parents who love their children absolutely and watch those children choose paths that horrify them while simultaneously recognizing that the world offering those children a different choice had failed in some fundamental way. Randy Huggins, the show's creator, has spoken about this in interviews. He said that what drew him to the Flannery story was not the crime, but the family. Ultimately, what they were doing was they were in search of the American dream. Huggins said of the Flannery brothers, and the show contextualizes that search within the economic and social collapse of 1980s Detroit, the shuttered factories, the underfunded schools, the failed institutions, in a way that makes the brothers' choices comprehensible even when they are not excusable. Charles and Lucille Flannery have been largely private figures throughout the decades of public attention to their son's story. They have not, to any significant public degree, become media personalities or sought to shape the narrative in a way that some family members of public figures do. What they have done, what they continue to do, is maintain the family bonds that the Flannery brothers' incarceration strained but did not sever. The relationship between Big Meech and his son Lil Meech, maintained across prison walls for 15 years, nurtured through recorded phone calls and monitored visits, is one of the most poignant threads in the entire BMF story. The son who was young when his father went to prison grew up to play his father on a major television series, channeling the legend of man he had not been able to live beside into a performance that the culture celebrated. That relationship, what it means to grow up as the son of one of America's most famous drug kingpins, to carry that name and that legacy, to find in it both burden and inheritance, is a story that could fill its own documentary. Lil Meech has spoken in interviews about the experience of playing his father and about the complexity of honoring a man whose choices he can both understand and wish had been different. The capacity to hold those two truths simultaneously, to love a parent without endorsing every choice that parent made, is a form of moral sophistication that most of us are never asked to demonstrate so publicly. There's a version of the BMF story that is told in nightclub conversations and rap lyrics and Instagram tributes, and it is mostly a story of triumph, the rise, the money, the cars, the parties, the music, the brotherhood. There's another version, documented in federal court records and police reports and the memories of people who lived in the communities the BMF operated in, and it is a story that contains more shadow. The violence was real. It was not incidental to the BMF's operations. It was structural. In any large-scale criminal organization operating in contested markets, violence is the enforcement mechanism that undergirds everything else. When a distributor fails to pay, when a competitor encroaches on territory, when someone inside the organization creates a risk by talking or by stealing, violence, threatened or actual, is a system of consequences that maintains order in the absence of legal contracts and courts. The The BMF was not unusual in this respect, but it was also not exempt from it. The shooting outside Chaos nightclub in Atlanta in June 2003, the incidents of violence that accompanied the protection of BMF's distribution network in multiple cities, the shooting of Big Meech himself in 2004, which resulted in the death of Anthony Wolf Jones. These were not isolated events. They were the visible surface of a substrate of threatened and actual violence that maintained the organization's operational discipline. The communities where BMF's cocaine was distributed, communities in Detroit, in Atlanta, in Louisville, in St. Louis, in cities across 11 states, experienced the downstream consequences of the organization's presence. Cocaine addiction is not an abstract phenomenon. It is people who began using cocaine recreationally and found they could not stop. People who lost jobs, lost families, lost health, lost years to a substance that the BMF helped make available and affordable in their neighborhoods. The human cost of the cocaine the BMF distributed is not calculated in any of the federal sentencing documents. The continuing criminal enterprise statute and the drug conspiracy charges focus on the trafficking, not the harm at the user level. The $270 million in alleged revenue does not appear in court records alongside an accounting of how many people became addicted to the cocaine that generated it. This is not a criticism of the federal prosecution. It is an observation about the limits of criminal law as a framework for understanding the full social cost of what the BMF did. The law punishes the traffickers. It does not and cannot capture the full ledger of damage. The celebration of the BMF legend in hip-hop culture tends to omit this part of the story. When Rick Ross says he thinks he's Big Meech, he is invoking an image of power and success, not an image of addiction clinics and family separations and communities where cocaine money competed with and often overwhelmed legitimate economic activity. The cultural celebration of the BMF is a celebration of the parts of the story that feel empowering, not the parts that feel tragic. This does not mean the celebration is illegitimate or that the people who participate in it are indifferent to suffering. It means that cultural memory is selective, and that the parts of a story that resonate with powerful emotions, aspiration, defiance, brotherhood, triumph, tend to displace the parts that evoke more complicated responses. The honest accounting of the Black Mafia family's legacy requires holding both the triumph and the tragedy simultaneously. The extraordinary achievement and the extraordinary cost, the brotherhood that built an empire and the cocaine that damaged communities, the ambition that refused to accept poverty and the harm that ambition spread on its way to escaping it. Both things are true. The full story requires both. The 2 years of Operation Motor City Mafia, October 2003 to October 2005, produced one of the most comprehensive documented portraits of a domestic drug trafficking organization in DEA history. The 900-page investigative file, which included wiretap transcripts, informant testimonies, financial records, and surveillance documentation, is a remarkable artifact. It is, in a very real sense, the most detailed picture that has ever been drawn of how the Black Mafia family actually worked. What emerges from that picture is an organization that was simultaneously more sophisticated and more vulnerable than its public image suggested. More sophisticated because the structural discipline that the Flannery brothers had built into BMF, the regional hierarchy, the separation of function between Atlanta distribution and Los Angeles supply intake, the financial camouflage of BMF Entertainment, the deliberate use of multiple legitimate-seeming business fronts, represented genuine organizational sophistication. The DEA Special Operations Division, which typically targeted international cartels, was assigned to this case because the BMF had achieved a level of operational complexity that warranted that level of investigative resource. More vulnerable, because the very things that made the BMF famous, the visibility, the celebrity connections, the billboards, the parties, the cultural brand, were gifts of federal investigators. Every party Big Meech threw was attended by people who could later be interviewed or recruited as informants. Every celebrity connection was a thread that investigators could pull. Every piece of media coverage of the BMF lifestyle gave the government a documented record of the organization's self-presentation. The wiretaps were particularly devastating. Conversations intercepted on BMF phones over the course of the investigation captured organizational discussions that gave investigators a real-time view of how the organization operated, who was in charge of what, how decisions were made, how cocaine was moved and money was laundered. In a world before encrypted messaging and the communication security practices that modern criminal organizations use, a federal wiretap was a window directly into the operational nervous system of the target organization. The use of informants, cooperating witnesses recruited from arrested lower-level members, was also crucial. The BMF's hierarchical structure, while it provided operational insulation at the top, created a chain of cooperating witnesses at the lower levels who each knew enough to illuminate the next level above them. An arrested street distributor could give investigators information about the lieutenant who supplied him. That lieutenant, facing federal charges, could cooperate and provide information about the regional manager above him. Step by step, the investigation worked its way up the hierarchy. The April 2004 Jabari Hayes motorhome stop on Interstate 44 in Missouri was, according to investigative accounts, a pivotal intelligence windfall. Hayes was not a peripheral figure. He was described as a BMF courier and high-level distributor. His arrest and the 95 kilograms of cocaine seized from the vehicle he was driving gave investigators both a significant evidence point and, eventually, a significant source of information about the organization's transportation methods and distribution network. By the time October 2005 arrived, the federal case was not just built, it was overwhelming. The government had not one or two pieces of decisive evidence, but dozens, hundreds of wiretap conversations, multiple cooperating witnesses at different levels of the organization, financial records documenting money laundering through multiple business fronts, physical evidence of cocaine seizures at multiple points in the supply chain, surveillance documentation of organizational meetings and communications. Against this kind of case, the options for defense were limited. The brothers' attorneys could challenge specific pieces of evidence and might succeed in suppressing some of it. They could challenge the credibility of cooperating witnesses and might undermine some of the testimony. But against a 900-page investigative file spanning 2 years of comprehensive federal surveillance, mounting a successful defense at trial was a near impossible task. The guilty pleas in November 2007 were, in the cold light of legal strategy, the rational choice. Taking the case to trial risked the same outcome, conviction, with potentially harsher sentencing for defendants who had forced the government to spend the additional resources of a lengthy trial. Pleading guilty, in exchange for the certainty of the sentence negotiated with prosecutors, was a pragmatic path. Both brothers, advised by experienced federal criminal defense attorneys, made the pragmatic choice. The specific cooperation that any BMF members provided, the identities of informants, the extent of their testimony, remains, in many cases, not fully publicly known. Federal cooperation agreements are frequently sealed, and the specific information that specific cooperating witnesses provided is often not part of the public record. What is known is that the investigation was substantially aided by testimony from inside the organization, and that this inside information accelerated the government's ability to build the case against the leadership. Every empire, legitimate or otherwise, leaves something behind when it falls. The Black Mafia family left behind several things simultaneously, and they are not all the same kind. It left behind the damage, the communities where its cocaine flowed, the people who were addicted, the families fractured by violence and imprisonment, the legitimate business owners in Atlanta and Detroit whose environments were shaped by the presence of a major drug trafficking organization. These costs are real and they persist, even as the organization that caused them has been gone for 2 decades. It left behind the vacated positions. When the DEA dismantled the BMF in 2005, the cocaine distribution networks that BMF had built and managed did not stop functioning. The demand for cocaine in Atlanta, in Detroit, in Louisville, in St. Louis, that demand did not end because Big Meech was in a federal facility in Mississippi. New organizations, new suppliers, new distributors moved into the spaces that BMF had occupied. In some cases, these were Mexican cartel representatives moving more directly into American distribution. The middleman had been eliminated, and the supplier moved closer to the retail level. In other cases, smaller local organizations filled parts of the void. The drug market reorganized, as drug markets always do. It left behind the money. Federal prosecutors seized over $21 million in assets through Operation Motor City Mafia. Cash, jewelry, vehicles, properties. The 13 mansions across Metro Detroit, Georgia, and Los Angeles were forfeited. The car fleet was seized. The jewelry from Jacob the jeweler was taken. But $21 million seized represent a fraction of the $270 million allegedly generated over 15 years. Where did the rest go? Some of it was spent on the lifestyle, on the parties, on the legal fees that preceded conviction, on the BMF Entertainment operation. Some of it may have been moved through channels that the investigators never fully traced. The financial legacy of the BMF empire is not fully accounted for in the public record. It left behind the relationships, the network of people who had worked within the BMF or alongside it, associates, distributors, entertainment figures, celebrity connections, did not disappear when the organization was dismantled. Those relationships persisted in various forms in the lives of the hundreds of people who had been part of the BMF universe. Some of those relationships became the basis for cooperation with federal investigators. Others became the basis for the cultural celebration that followed the organization's fall, and it left behind a legend. The most durable and, in some ways, the most consequential thing the Black Mafia family left behind was its own mythology, a mythology so powerful that it generated a major television series, spawned cultural references across decades of hip-hop, and turned two brothers from Detroit into figures whose names are known internationally. The legend of the Black Mafia family is not just a story about crime. It is a story about ambition in the face of exclusion, about what happens when intelligence and drive find no legitimate outlet, about the specific texture of Black American poverty in the late 20th century and the choices that poverty forced on people who refused to accept it as their permanent condition, about brotherhood, the power of it, the fragility of it, and what happens when two brothers who built everything together can no longer agree on how to protect what they have built. It is, in its deepest register, a story about the American dream, and about what the American dream looks like when the normal doors are closed and people find other doors. The relationship between the Black Mafia family and the hip-hop music industry is one of the most discussed and least fully documented aspects of the BMF story. It is also, in many ways, the most culturally consequential. At the surface level, the connection is clear. Big Meech launched BMF Entertainment as a record label and promotion company. BMF Entertainment signed Blue Da Vinci and was associated with Young Jeezy. Big Meech used the wealth generated by cocaine trafficking to fund music promotion, artist development, and the kind of nightclub presence that was, in the early 2000s, the primary mechanism for building a hip-hop artist reputation in the South. But the connections went deeper and were more widely distributed than the formal structure of BMF Entertainment suggests. The hip-hop industry of the early 2000s was an industry in which the lines between street life and music business were, in many cases, extremely blurry. Authenticity, the credibility that came from actually having lived the experiences described in rap lyrics, was the currency of a genre. Artists who could claim genuine connection to the street world had a commercial advantage that artists without that connection struggled to replicate. And the men who ran the street world, who had the money, the connections, the social capital of the drug trade, were, in many cities, the gatekeepers of the credibility that the music business needed. Big Meech occupied a unique position in this ecosystem. He was not a musician. He was not a traditional music industry executive. But he was, by the early 2000s, one of the most socially connected and financially powerful figures in Atlanta's social world, a world that overlapped significantly with the music industry. He could get an artist's music heard in every strip club in Atlanta. He could provide the luxury cars and diamond jewelry that made a music video look like it was made by someone who had already succeeded. He could bring 100 people to a nightclub appearance and make it feel like the event of the year. The specific nature of his financial relationship with various artists has never been fully documented in the public record. Young Jeezy was never signed to BMF Entertainment and never charged with any drug-related offense. T.I. has denied any meaningful financial relationship with BMF. The extent to which Big Meech actually helped various artists' careers versus the extent to which he was in proximity to artists whose careers were rising for their own reasons is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that the cultural influence was real. The BMF presence in Atlanta's music scene helped shape the visual and lifestyle aesthetic of early 2000s trap music, the genre that would eventually come to dominate global popular music. The imagery of BMF, the Maybachs, the diamonds, the furs, the enormous entourages, the nightclub tables, was absorbed into hip-hop's visual vocabulary and is still visible in music videos and artist presentations decades later. Big Meech genuinely believed in music. He was not just using the music industry as a cover for drug dealing. Though it served that purpose, he cared about it. He loved it. When he says in interviews that the best thing about his entire career was helping young Jeezy's career take off. That is not a performance. It is a statement of a man who found genuine joy and meaning in the work of music promotion, who experienced in helping an artist he believed in reach a wider audience, something that felt, in his own accounting, like his highest achievement. This makes the BMF hip-hop relationship more complex and more tragic than a simple story of drug money corrupting the music industry. It is also the story of a man who, had circumstances been different, might have been exactly what he claimed to want to be, a music mogul, a legitimate entertainment entrepreneur, someone whose contribution to the culture was celebrated without an asterisk. He was not that. He was Big Meech, the drug lord who wanted to be a music mogul, the man who built an empire that the government tore down, and who was remembered, as much as anything else, for the music he helped push into the world. There's a version of the Black Mafia Family story that was never told in a courtroom, the version that would have been told if Demetrius and Terry Flannery had chosen to fight the government's case all the way to trial. Federal criminal trials of this magnitude, involving a 900-page investigative file, dozens of cooperating witnesses, years of wiretap evidence, and charges under the continuing criminal enterprise statute, are among the most dramatic and legally complex proceedings in the American judicial system. They can last months. They produce daily headlines. They become, in the American cultural imagination, an event. The BMF trial never happened. The brothers pleaded guilty in November 2007. The reasons for this decision have been discussed above. The overwhelming evidence, the legal calculus, the rational choice to avoid the additional risk of trial. But the decision also meant that the full, detailed public examination of the BMF's operations, the testimony, the documents, the organizational maps, never received the full public airing that a trial would have provided. The guilty plea was, in some ways, consistent with an important value that criminal organizations typically hold: discretion. A trial would have required the government to present its case publicly, including the identities and testimonies of cooperating witnesses. Those witnesses, if named in open court, would face risks that a sealed cooperation agreement might avoid. The brothers' willingness to plead guilty without forcing the government to expose its informants in open court can be read as a final act of organizational loyalty, protecting, even in surrender, the people who had worked within the BMF. Or it can simply be read as a rational legal decision that it appeared to be, in a federal criminal case with the evidentiary weight of the BMF prosecution. A guilty plea in exchange for a negotiated sentence was a rational choice. What the plea meant for the brothers was certainty. A 30-year sentence is devastating, but it is a known quantity. A trial could produce a longer sentence, or the same sentence, with the additional cost of years of appellate litigation and the exposure of cooperating witnesses. The guilty plea resolved the uncertainty and, in a strange way, closed the chapter with a kind of finality that a trial, with all its drama and uncertainty, might not have provided. The plea also meant that the Flannery brothers never had to publicly account, in the specific and detailed way that trial testimony demands, for the full scope of what they had done. The admissions made in a guilty plea: we distributed cocaine throughout the United States from 1990 through 2005 in a continuing criminal enterprise, are legally sufficient but narratively thin. They do not require the kind of granular self-examination that cross-examination would have produced. This is not, ultimately, a criticism. It is simply an observation about the nature of the proceeding that ended the Black Mafia family's legal story. The BMF ended not with a dramatic trial, but with two men in a federal courtroom in Detroit, entering formal admissions to charges that they had spent their lives building toward, and then walking in handcuffs toward the separate federal facilities where they would spend the next 2 to 3 decades. One of the questions that rarely gets asked in the celebration of the BMF legend is the most practical one. What happened after they left? The cities the BMF had operated in did not stand still. The cocaine markets that BMF had served and supplied did not evaporate. The communities where the BMF's money had circulated, sometimes as genuine economic activity, sometimes as the proceeds of violence, continue to have the same underlying conditions that had made those markets possible in the first place. In Atlanta, the dismantling of BMF's distribution network created a temporary disruption. Prices may have spiked as supply chains were reorganized. Street-level distributors who had been supplied by BMF's network had to find new suppliers. But within a relatively short period, the Mexican cartels that had been BMF's upstream suppliers, organizations that dwarfed the BMF in both scale and organizational capacity, extended their reach more directly into American distribution markets. The middleman had been eliminated. The cartel moved closer to the street. One DEA official, quoted in a contemporaneous account, put it starkly, the Mexican cartels could wipe their feet on BMF. When the DEA dismantled BMF in Atlanta, it was removing one piece from a much larger supply chain. The seizure of $22 million in cash and 16,000 kilograms of cocaine from a single Mexican cartel operation in Atlanta around the same period, dwarfing anything the BMF had accumulated, illustrated the relative scale. The BMF was a powerful American middleman in a supply chain controlled by organizations against which the BMF was modest in comparison. Detroit, BMF's home city, had its own trajectory after 2005. The city was entering the period of its most severe economic crisis. The auto industry bailouts of 2008 and 2009, the population loss that would eventually lead to the city's bankruptcy in 2013. The economic devastation that had created the conditions for the BMF's rise in the 1980s and 1990s was, if anything, deepening. The street-level drug economy in Detroit continued to function, supplied by whoever stepped into the spaces that BMF had once occupied. In the broader American drug landscape, the period after BMF's fall was one of significant change. Cocaine use in America actually declined somewhat in the late 2000s, though not because of BMF's dismantling. The broader trends in drug use are driven by factors far more complex than the prosecution of a single organization. The rise of prescription opioids and later fentanyl during this period created a different and in many ways more devastating drug crisis than the cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s. The communities that had been damaged by cocaine now faced new threats that the public health system was even less prepared to address than the cocaine epidemic had been. None of this is to say that dismantling the BMF was without value. Removing a large-scale cocaine distribution organization from a market does reduce supply, at least temporarily, and the federal investment in Operation Motor City Mafia produced genuine law enforcement results. The 30-year sentences imposed on the Flannery brothers were consistent with the statutory framework and with the government's assessment of the gravity of what they had done. But it is worth being honest about what the BMF's dismantling did and did not accomplish. It punished the Flannery brothers. It disrupted, temporarily, one supply chain in a national cocaine market. It did not eliminate cocaine use in the cities where the BMF had operated. It did not address the underlying conditions, poverty, lack of opportunity, institutional neglect, that had produced the BMF in the first place. And it did not prevent the next generation of organizations from rising to fill the space the BMF vacated. The war on drugs has been waged in America for more than 50 years. The BMF was, in the annals of that war, one of the most significant domestic battlefields. The government won the battle, but the war, by any honest accounting, has not been won. The story of the Black Mafia Family, as it is typically told, centers almost entirely on the men who led and built the organization. Big Meech and Southwest T, the lieutenants, the distributors, the celebrity associates, the federal investigators. But the BMF was not an all-male institution, and the women who moved through its orbit in various capacities, with varying degrees of awareness of what they were part of, are part of the story in ways that have not received proportional attention. The Starz television series BMF has made an effort to address this dimension of the story. The portrayal of Lucille Flannery, the brother's mother, gives the show a crucial perspective on the family's experience that the pure crime narrative tends to omit. But Lucille is not the only woman whose story matters in the BMF universe. There were women who worked in BMF's business operations, in ways both knowing and unknowing. Money was laundered through businesses where women were employees or managers. Legitimate front companies employ people, men and women, who may not have fully understood the financial nature of the enterprise they were working for. The tentacles of a large money laundering operation touch many people who are not, themselves, participants in the underlying criminal activity. There were also women in the personal orbits of the Flenory brothers, partners, family members, associates, who navigated the specific challenges of being close to men who were simultaneously building an empire and becoming federal targets. The specific personal relationships of the Flenory brothers are not subjects they have addressed in detail in public accounts, and respecting that privacy is appropriate. But the general experience of women adjacent to major criminal organizations, the uncertainty, the fear, the financial complexity, the legal exposure, is a dimension of the BMF story that the mythology of the enterprise tends to obscure. It is worth noting that the continuing criminal enterprise charges that ultimately convicted the Flenory brothers implicated, either directly or indirectly, dozens of people across multiple states. Some of those people were women. Some were prosecuted. Some cooperated with the government. Some were, in the legal language, bystanders whose proximity to the organization created legal exposure even when their personal involvement in drug trafficking was limited. The BMF story, fully told, includes these dimensions. It is not only the story of two brilliant and ambitious brothers who built something extraordinary. It is also the story of an enormous social universe. Hundreds of people whose lives were shaped, sometimes catastrophically, by their proximity to the organization. On January 27, 2026, if the Bureau of Prisons' projected release date holds, Demetrius Edward Flenory will be a free man. He was transferred to a halfway house in Miami on October 15, 2024. The conditions of a supervised release will include 5 years of federal supervision, regular check-ins, restrictions on travel and association, and the ongoing presence of the federal government in his life in ways that define what freedom means for someone in his situation. He will be 57 years old in January 2026. He will have spent nearly 20 years, from 2005 to 2024 in federal custody, from 2024 to 2026 in a halfway house, in federal confinement. He will be returning to a world that has changed enormously since 2005. The music industry he dreamed of dominating has been transformed by streaming platforms and social media and algorithms into something unrecognizable from the industry of the early 2000s. The Atlanta he knew has changed. The hip-hop industry he loved has changed. His son Lil Meech has become a public figure in his own right through the BMF television series and through his own growing public presence. What Big Meech does with his freedom is, as of this writing, genuinely unknown. He has hinted, through various communications, at wanting to pursue legitimate opportunities in the entertainment industry, which would be an ironic fulfillment of the ambition that drove the creation of BMF Entertainment. His cultural profile, boosted enormously by the Starz series and by the ongoing celebration of his legend in hip-hop culture, would give him more genuine access to the entertainment world than he had in 2005. He has a story to tell that could fill a book, a documentary, a podcast, a television interview circuit. He also has 5 years of federal supervised release that will, in various ways, constrain those pursuits. The conditions of supervised release in federal cases involving convicted drug kingpins typically include restrictions on associating with known criminals, on travel, on financial activities, and on business dealings that might implicate the federal prohibition on benefiting financially from criminal activity. Whether Big Meech can parlay his cultural profile into legitimate income while meeting these conditions is a legal question that his attorneys will presumably navigate carefully. The other question, the harder one, is whether 2 decades of incarceration have changed a man. Demetrius Flenory at 57 is not Demetrius Flenory at 37. When the government arrested him, 2 decades in federal prison changes a person. Sometimes it hardens. Sometimes it deepens. Sometimes it produces a kind of clarity that is unavailable to people who have not experienced that level of enforced self-examination. Big Meech has, in his prison communications and interviews, shown flashes of this complexity, moments when the mythology of Big Meech and the humanity of Demetrius Flenory coexist in the same statement. He has spoken about the people he met in prison, about respect and honor, about faith and survival. He has not, publicly, articulated the kind of full accounting for the harm his organization caused that civil society might wish to hear. He has maintained his brand, as Assistant U.S. Attorney Dawn Eisen observed with frustration in her court filing, in ways that do not suggest a man who is fully separated from the identity that built the empire. Whether he can find a way to honor the legend of Big Meech while building something new for Demetrius Flannery, something that does not require the destruction of communities to fund the spectacle, is a question that will define the final chapter of this story. Southwest T, for his part, has been navigating life outside prison since 2020 and free of federal supervision since President Biden's commutation. He has been characteristically quiet about his plans and activities, consistent with the personality that defined his approach to the BMF's operations throughout its existence. He is, by all accounts, rebuilding a private life with the same discretion that he always brought to the work that built the organization. Every great American story, and the story of the Black Mafia family is, whatever else it is, a great American story, teaches something about the country that produced it. The lessons are not always comfortable. They are not always the lessons we are inclined to draw, but they are there, embedded in the facts, waiting to be examined. Lesson 1. The American dream is not equally available to everyone who dreams it. The Flannery brothers did not lack ambition, intelligence, work ethic, or the capacity for organizational genius. What they lacked was a legitimate channel for those qualities, a world that would recognize and reward their capabilities without asking them to start from a position of radical disadvantage. The BMF is not evidence that crime pays. The Flannery brothers are in the public record as men who spent decades in federal prison for what they built. The BMF is evidence that when legitimate opportunity is systematically withheld, people find other opportunities, and that the intelligence and drive required to build an enormous criminal enterprise could, in a different world, build an enormous legitimate enterprise. Lesson 2. The war on drugs, as prosecuted over the past 50 years, has not achieved its stated goals. The BMF was dismantled. The cocaine kept flowing. The communities that were damaged by cocaine's presence were not healed by the prosecution of the people who supplied it. The mandatory minimum sentences that drove the Flannery brothers' 30-year terms have been extensively criticized by experts across the political spectrum as disproportionate to the actual harm reduction they produce. The ongoing reassessment of those sentences, which reduced the Flannery brothers' terms under amended guidelines, reflect a broader societal reckoning with the policies of the Reagan-era war on drugs that is still underway. Lesson 3. Culture is more powerful than crime statistics. The Black Mafia family has been celebrated, memorialized, dramatized, and referenced in hip-hop for decades. Its story has generated a major television series that has run for 4 seasons and continues. Its founders' names are known internationally by people who have no connection to drug trafficking and no interest in crime, but who are fascinated by the story of ambition, brotherhood, and the specific texture of Black American life that the BMF story embodies. The government won the legal battle. The culture declared the legend victorious. Lesson 4. Brotherhood is the most fragile and most essential thing. The relationship between Demetrius and Terry Flannery is, at its core, the story of 2 brothers who built everything together and then, under pressure what they built, began to pull in different directions. The estrangement between them in the early 2000s was not just a personal tragedy. It was an organizational vulnerability that the federal government was able to exploit. And the contrast between the brother who maintained his public profile through prison and the brother who maintained his silence, and who, as a result, received a presidential commutation while the other was denied, is one of the most instructive things in the entire story. Sometimes what you do not say matters more than what you do. Lesson 5. The American legal system is formidable and systematic in ways that individual genius, however extraordinary, cannot permanently outrun. Operation Motor City Mafia was a 2-year multi-agency, multi-city investigation that produced 900 pages of documented evidence. It was methodical, patient, and comprehensive. The BMF was brilliant. The federal government was relentless. And in the end, relentless and methodical prevailed over brilliant and spectacular. This is not a comfortable lesson for people who admire the BMF, but it is a true one. Lesson 6. legacy outlives enterprise. The Black Mafia Family, as a cocaine distribution organization, is gone. The cocaine is not moving through the channels it built. The mansions were seized. The cars are gone. The jewelry was taken. But the legend, the name, the story, the television series, the tattoos, the rap lyrics, the cultural presence, is, 20 years after the organization's destruction, more alive than ever. Big Meech did achieve what he set out to achieve. He is famous. His name is known. The world knows who he is. That he achieved this at a cost, that his organization spread across thousands of lives in dozens of communities, is part of the accounting that history will eventually settle. The 30-year sentences imposed on the Flannery brothers were not exceptional for their time. Under the sentencing guidelines applicable to continuing criminal enterprise convictions involving the drug quantities attributed to the BMF, 30 years was consistent with what the guidelines prescribed. The sentences reflected a philosophy of drug enforcement that dominated American criminal justice policy from the 1980s through the early 2000s. That mandatory minimum sentences for major drug traffickers served essential deterrence and incapacitation functions, and that the length of those sentences should reflect the scale of the trafficking operation rather than the individual characteristics of the defendants. This philosophy has been extensively contested. Critics from across the political spectrum, from libertarian conservatives to progressive civil rights advocates, have argued that mandatory minimum drug sentences are disproportionate, racially disparate in their application, and ineffective as deterrents. The evidence on deterrence is, at best, mixed. High sentences for drug trafficking do not appear to have significantly reduced drug use in America, which has fluctuated based on factors, cultural trends, the availability of specific drugs, public health responses, that have little to do with the sentence length faced by trafficking organization leaders. The amendments to the United States sentencing guidelines that reduce Big Meech's sentence, Amendments 782 and 788, revising the drug quantity table, were themselves part of a broader policy reassessment. The Sentencing Commission's decision to reduce offense levels for drug quantity and to make those reductions retroactive reflected an explicit acknowledgement that the prior guidelines had imposed sentences longer than necessary for the purposes of criminal justice. The further reduction in early 2024, described as part of a broader effort to reform sentencing for nonviolent drug offenders, was consistent with this evolving understanding. The presidential commutation granted to Southwest T by President Biden was even more explicitly political, part of a broader initiative to address what the administration characterized as inequities in the sentencing of people who have been released to home confinement during the pandemic. The commutation did not say that what Terry Flannery had done was acceptable or that his original sentence was unjust. It said that having served the time he had served, under the conditions he had served it, the continuation of his sentence in its original form was no longer warranted. These are policy judgments that reasonable people can and do disagree about. The families of people who were harmed by BMF's cocaine, people who became addicted, people who died of overdoses, people who lost family members to the violence that accompanied the drug trade, may view 30-year sentences as insufficient rather than excessive. Law enforcement professionals who spent years investigating the BMF may feel that the sentence reductions and commutations undermine the deterrence value of the original convictions. The debate about appropriate criminal punishment is one that American society has been having, in different forms, for as long as there has been criminal law. The BMF case is a particularly vivid illustration of the stakes of that debate, a case where the facts are extreme in every direction, where the organizational sophistication and the scale of harm are both enormous, and where the human stories of the people involved resist simplification. In 2022, Starz released a documentary series alongside its scripted BMF drama, the BMF documentary, Blowing Money Fast. This documentary, which included interviews with figures connected to the BMF story, historical footage and documentation, and the kind of first-person testimony that the scripted drama cannot replicate, provided a different and complementary lens on the story. The documentary represents something significant in the BMF's cultural legacy, the movement of the story from mythology to documented history. The scripted series creates a version of the story shaped by dramatic necessity. It compresses and fictionalizes and dramatizes in ways that serve the narrative logic of television. The documentary attempts to present the historical record with more fidelity to the specifics of what actually happened. Together, the The scripted series and the documentary represent the most comprehensive public examination of the Black Mafia family story that has yet been produced. They draw on interviews with people who were close to the events, on documentary evidence, and on the willingness of people who lived through the BMF era to speak publicly about experiences that, for many years, were simply not discussed. The documentary also raises, more directly than the scripted series, some of the harder questions about the BMF's legacy, including the question of how to assess the harm the organization caused and how to hold that assessment alongside the genuine admiration that many people feel for what the Flannery brothers built. Randy Huggins, who created the scripted series, has spoken about the intentional choice to tell the story from inside the BMF's perspective, to make the viewer understand and, to some extent, identify with the Flannery brothers, rather than from the perspective of the law enforcement agencies that eventually brought them down. This is a choice with consequences for how the story is received and what lessons viewers draw from it. A story told from inside the BMF's perspective naturally centers the aspirations, the brotherhood, the achievement. A story told from the perspective of the DEA agents who investigated them would naturally center the harm, the investigation, the justice system's response. The Starz BMF project, across both its scripted and documentary components, leans toward the former. It is a celebration, with caveats, a tribute to two brothers' story that does not fully avoid the cost of that story, but does not make those costs its central concern. At its deepest level, the story of the Black Mafia family is a story about brotherhood, not in the casual sense in which the word is used in street culture, to mean any alliance or loyalty, but in the literal sense. Two brothers, born to the same parents, who built everything they had together and then watched what they had built pull them apart. Demetrius and Terry Flannery came from the same household. They shared the same poverty, the same faith community their parents maintained, the same streets. They started together. Same $50 bags, same corner, same early arrests, same dangerous initiation into the street world. And they built together. The same supply chain, the same organization, the same vision of an empire that could transcend the limitations of the world they had been born into. The estrangement of the early 2000s is, in light of all this shared history, profoundly sad. Two men who had done everything together, who had survived violence and early arrests and enormous pressure building a criminal empire, pulling apart over the fundamental question of how visible to be, how much to let the world see you, while the federal government watched. The different outcomes they experienced, Big Meech's denied pandemic releases against Southwest T's compassionate release and eventual presidential commutation, reflect, in part, this fundamental difference in how they had chosen to present themselves. Southwest T's discretion, his deliberate avoidance of the kind of public profile his brother cultivated, served him when the federal system was making judgments about rehabilitation and risk. Big Meech's insistence on maintaining his brand, on continuing to be Big Meech even from behind bars, worked against him in that same system. And yet, from a different perspective, it was Big Meech's visibility, his insistence on being seen and known and celebrated, that generated the cultural legacy that has made the BMF story endure. The television series is primarily about Big Meech. The rap lyrics invoke Big Meech. The cultural celebration is primarily about the flamboyant older brother who refused to be invisible. Southwest T, by being the prudent one, has lived a better life post-incarceration. But it is Big Meech who has become a legend. This is not a paradox so much as it is a truth about how fame and legend work. The qualities that make someone famous are often the same qualities that make them vulnerable. Visibility is simultaneously power and risk. The man who puts his name on a billboard is the man who gets remembered and the man who gets arrested first. The brotherhood at the heart of the BMF story, whatever strains it, whatever breaks it, is also what redeems it. The reason millions of people connect to this story is not ultimately the cocaine, or the cars, or the parties. It is a relationship between two brothers who started with nothing and decided, together, that nothing was not their destiny. The specifics of how they acted on that decision are documented in federal court records and are genuinely harmful. But the impulse, the refusal to accept the poverty that was handed to them, the insistence on building something larger than what they have been given, is a human impulse that resonates across lines of culture and class and geography and race. This is why the BMF story endures. Not because crime is admirable, but because ambition is human. And because the story of two brothers from Detroit who dared to imagine a life larger than what their city was offering them is, in its deepest structure, a story about what it means to be alive and hungry in a world that has not made room for you. So, what do we make of all of this? How do we hold the complete story of the Black Mafia family in our minds? The $270 million and the 30-year sentences, the 13 mansions and the communities damaged by cocaine, the brotherhood and estrangement, the legend and the cost of building it. The complete accounting of the Black Mafia family requires us to resist the temptation of simplicity. The simple story, two villains who poisoned their communities and got what they deserved, misses too much. The simple story, two visionaries who built something extraordinary and were punished for it by a racist and unjust system, also misses too much. The true story is harder. It contains men of genuine genius who chose to apply that genius in ways that cause real and lasting harm. It contains a legal system that appropriately prosecuted that harm, but did so through a sentencing regime that most experts now agree was disproportionate. It contains a culture that found in the BMF story something that felt like a reflection of its own experience of American exclusion, and that chose to celebrate the reflection rather than complicate it. It contains two brothers who loved each other, built everything together, broke under the pressure of what they had built, and now live in the aftermath of choices that cannot be undone. Demetrius Edward Flannery, born June 21st, 1968, in Detroit, Michigan, known as Big Meech, co-founder of the Black Mafia family, convicted of leading a continuing criminal enterprise involving the large-scale distribution of cocaine throughout the United States from 1990 through 2005, sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, sentence reduced by various amendments to the federal sentencing guidelines to approximately 27 years. Transferred to a Miami halfway house on October 15, 2024. Projected for full release on January 27, 2026. The subject of a major Starz television series now in its 4th season. His name in the lyrics of more rap songs than anyone has counted. His legend alive and growing 2 decades after the empire fell. Terry Lee Flannery, known as Southwest T, co-founder of the Black Mafia family, the operational mind behind the Los Angeles hub, and the supply chain that connected Mexican cartel sources to American distribution markets across 11 states. Convicted alongside his brother, sentenced to 30 years, later reduced, as part of the same legal proceedings, to a shorter term. Released to home confinement in May 2020 in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Granted presidential commutation by President Joe Biden. Free, living, as he has always preferred to live, in something approaching privacy. The quieter half of the most famous criminal partnership in American hip-hop history. Together, the Black Mafia family. Founded in 1985, Southwest Detroit. Years active, 1985 to 2005. Territory, more than 11 states across the United States. Revenue, estimated $270 million. Membership at peak, over 500. Activities, cocaine trafficking, money laundering. Supply chain, direct connections to Mexican cartel sources via Los Angeles intake hub. Distribution hubs, Atlanta, Los Angeles, Detroit, St. Louis, and distribution points across the southeastern United States, Midwest, and beyond. Cultural legacy, incalculable. Status, dismantled. But the name lives on. So here we are, 2.5 hours into one of the most extraordinary stories in American criminal history. Two brothers from Detroit who caught the bus with holes in their shoes and built a $270 million empire from nothing, who moved 2,500 kilograms of cocaine through a single hub every single month, who had celebrities, athletes, and music moguls in their orbit, who put their name on a billboard and dared the world to see them, and who ultimately were seen by the DA, by the IRS, by every federal agency that Operation Motor City Mafia brought to bear on them. Big Meech once said he wanted the world to know his name. The world knows his name, whether that is a triumph or a tragedy, or, as the truth usually is, both at the same time, is a question that the story itself will not answer for you. You have to answer it for yourself. With the full weight of what you now know about the cocaine, and the communities, and the brotherhood, and the ambition and the consequences, with the understanding that the story of Demetrius and Terry Flannery is, in its deepest structure, a story about what happens when American poverty meets American hunger, and the answer that hunger finds is not what anyone, including the two brothers who lived it, would choose again with full knowledge of where it leads. If this video kept you watching from start to finish, and you just sat through a complete story of one of the most extraordinary organizations in American history, then smash that like button right now. It genuinely helps us make more content like this, and it tells us that you want stories told at this depth and this length. Subscribe to the channel if you are not already subscribed. We tell the complete stories, the full history, the facts, the context, the things that other channels leave out every week. And drop in the comments, who do you think was smarter, Big Meech or Southwest T? The showman who built the legend or the quiet operator who ended up free first? I am going to be reading every single comment on this one. The Black Mafia Family. From the southwest side of Detroit to the pages of federal court records to the screens of a Starz television series to your screen right now. 2 decades after it ended, the world is BMF's. Or at least, the legend is. Until next time, stay curious, stay locked in,